Welcome, everybody, from wherever you are in the world. I want to start with 8 words that I think has the power and the authority to bring peace and stability right across the world. It's these words. The army, as a permanent institution, is abolished. I'll say that again. The army, as a permanent institution, is abolished. That's an extract from Article 12 of the Constitution of Costa Rica, made in 1948, 76 years ago. The army, as a permanent institution, is abolished. Well, I'd love to see that in Australia, in our Constitution. But here, I'll be very brief. Today, we gather here on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I personally can only acknowledge their land because I personally am from the Kabi Kabi people on my father's side, Gurang Gurang on my mother's side, and I also have a grandfather who was forcibly removed from Ambram Island in Vanuatu, along with 60,000 others. He was only 12 years old at the time, brought into Australia. So that's another part of our story and another part of our history. And so for me, I just want to say that I hold in my heart the soil and the land and the spirit of this land where I now live, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge the wisdom, knowledge, and expertise of the Gadigal ancestors in their custodianship of these lands that I now call my home. I acknowledge and recognize their ancestors whose wisdom have cared for this land for millennia. And through the soil and through my heart, I recognize and acknowledge the families and children of the Gadigal clan who lived and celebrated and communed together on these lands. I also want to acknowledge and recognize their blood, the blood that was shed in defense of these lands, both in violence as well as in innocence. I acknowledge and recognize the elders who have come recently, who have toiled and died on these lands and left us a legacy that all people can enjoy the benefits of their labor on this soil. I also acknowledge the responsibility I have in stewarding and caring for these lands. This responsibility now rests on my shoulders. My responsibility is to care for the land and soil upon which I now live, so that our children's children can celebrate and enjoy the fruits of this soil, so that they too can live a healthy, prosperous, and happy life on the land and soil of the Gadigal people. But I also want to acknowledge and recognise our collective responsibility that we all have to care for all the lands and soils we have the honour to be birthed upon and to live upon and work upon today. So let's affirm our connection to the lands we now live and work upon. Let's acknowledge our elders who worked on those lands for our benefit. And let us pledge that we too will steward the land according to the wisdom, knowledge, and expertise that we now possess, so that we can pass on to our children's children the best that our land can provide for them and their children's children. And let us also undertake together on this important day, this day of peace, the important task to care for our Mother Earth, so that our future generations are not robbed or deprived of their rightful inheritance. That is our responsibility to pass on to them, so that they can enjoy the same entitlements and benefits that we have enjoyed on these lands that we all call our home. And I'll close with that. Article 12 from the Constitution of Costa Rica. We can achieve this if the army, as a permanent institution, is abolished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray, for your views, which I'm sure all of us endorse warmly and acknowledge with respect. So I already said welcome over and above Greta in the United States, which I shouldn't have done, but welcome again. This conference will travel virtually around the world, and it visits sites near US military bases, with the concluding event in Washington, DC, the heart of the US military base empire, to which Ray referred. Our aim in World Beyond War is to consider the impact of and in this conference, to consider the impact of America's military base empire and how we can resist it. And for Australia, that in particular means AUKUS. World Beyond War is a global, non-violent movement that aims to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. World Beyond War is a non-profit organization with chapters around the world that uses activist, educational, and media work to advance its objectives. It has a board and advisory board, staff, and chapter organizers all around the world, and it works with allied organizations, many of which are WBW affiliates. I'm Alison Broinowski, and I'm a board member of World Beyond War in Australia. We have 2 chapters, one in Victoria led by Alan Clayton, and one in Victoria led by Jeff Holland. World Beyond War was founded on January the 1st, 2014. So this year is its 10th anniversary, and we're going to celebrate that in October this year. The co-founders, David Hartzog and David Swanson, together with a group of like-minded peace advocates, set out a decade ago to create a global movement to abolish the institution of war itself, not just the war of the day. The main task that WBW set itself is to promote transition to a global security system that is supported not by armies, but by international law, diplomacy, collaboration, human rights, and uses non-violent action rather than threats of violence. The work of WBW includes education and media production that dispels myths such as war is natural or we've always had wars, and shows people that it actually can be abolished, as armies can in Chile, in Costa Rica. The World Beyond War engages in a wide variety of non-violent actions and campaigns that try to move the world towards the direction of ending all wars. This is a really busy time for conferences. All of us are conferenced out, I suspect. Today is the International Day of Peace and the start of the Global Week for Peace and Climate Justice. Of course, it shouldn't be confined to a week or a day, that effort. But the UN General Assembly is in session in New York with particular emphasis on peace at this time. And 124 delegations have voted in favor of a resolution to end the conflict in Gaza and the occupation of the Palestinian territories. Regrettably, Australia did not join them. This is the final weekend of the Festival of Peace, organized by Sydney group Raising Peace, which has collaborated with World Beyond War's Greta Zarrow and David Swanson in arranging this event today. And we warmly thank James Cox and Reese Suringer and their colleagues for their amazing efforts with all of that. There's a groundswell of global opinion against war, and others, which we see reflected in the 500 registrants for this conference from 47 countries and its 14 sponsors, 16 endorsers, and more than 40 speakers. For Australians, as I said, AUKUS is not the way to secure peace, but to provoke war in our region, which we have not seen since the 1970s. Professor Hugh White at ANU has called AUKUS the most disastrous defense policy mistake in our history, and one of the worst on record anywhere. So that's why we will find ourselves concentrating on that today. In the first session, you'll hear from distinguished speakers about that problem. And in the second, you'll hear proposals for a solution from 3 more experts who will discuss how Australia could achieve strategic independence and stay out of war in our region. So in other words, when this was planned, we said, what's the problem and what's the solution? And so our program this morning is divided neatly into those 2 considerations. And our moderators for the first and second sessions are Dr. Keith Suter and Melanie Morrison, who we thank for coming and doing that for us to get the No War 24 conference underway. Keith.
Thank you, Alison. I join with others in acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the land of the Eora people, and pay tribute to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. If you have a mobile phone, could you switch it to silent, please? It's worth bearing in mind, we've had the attention to the AUKUS defence agreement, but as we are meeting here, the leaders of 4 countries are meeting at President Biden's private home in Delaware to work out how they're going to be dealing with the China problem. So these are the Quad leaders. So that's the Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. So the war drums are certainly beating in our region. Our task this morning is to have the problems set out. We have 4 excellent speakers. The Honourable Bob Carr will be followed by Karina Lester, who will be followed by Peter Cronau, and Sue Wareham, who's got another commitment down in Canberra, will appear on the screen as the 4th speaker. We will then move into questions. I've suggested that we have a 10-minute presentation, short and snappy, to leave us with plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, let me go to our first speaker, Professor the Honourable Bob Carr, who was the longest continuously serving Premier in the history of New South Wales. He then entered the Federal Senate in 2012 and served as Australia's Foreign Minister for 18 months. Since leaving politics, Bob has led a distinguished career as an author and as an academic. He was director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology from 2014 to 2019, and Bob will give the overall picture of relations between the United States and Australia. Bob?
Thanks, Keith. Thanks very much. Ray should be congratulated on giving that report on the Constitution of Costa Rica. It's a non-militarized state, but also has a wonderful record on nature conservation. I was able, as Environment Minister, to get up in the Legislative Assembly at question time and say, New South Wales, under the Rand government, increased national park size by 100%. The only other country in the world to do this in a 10-year period is Costa Rica. And old Neville Rand said to me once, he said, I think the minister ought to be congratulated on being able to quote those figures about Costa Rica. But they have got a non-militarized constitution. Significance for our day, bear in mind that the leadership of Palestine is putting on the agenda its readiness to have a Palestinian state on what is now the occupied West Bank as a non-militarized state, which is a big concession. They say they're prepared to put that on the table for negotiation, a big concession, a big investment in peace, a big commitment to meeting Israel's security concerns. AUKUS is going to collapse of its own weight. I was in a panel at the Minerals Council of Australia. Dennis Richardson was there. He heard my criticisms of AUKUS, and he said, well, if it's going to fall over, Bob, why do you spend so much time opposing it? And I said, Dennis, I declined an invitation to organise a public meeting about AUKUS because I said to the organisers, this is going to fall flat on its face. This is going to collapse. And it won't be the next president, the one elected on November the 5th, who'll make the decision. It's going to be the president after that. And we don't know who is going to be inaugurated on January the 20th, 2029. It's that far off. It's incredible, an incredible proposition that the president inaugurated in 2029 is going to say to his or her defence secretary, oh, that's fine. We're in a competition for the number of boats with China. That's fine. We'll just peel off 3 or 5 of vessels that we were counting on to be nuclear armed and give them to Australia. And even if Australia feels obliged to join us in a war with China, they won't be nuclear armed. No American president is going to do that. That's a reduction in their force lineup, their order of battle, at a time when their shipyards can't keep up, can't deliver the targets they've got. Yes, they might peel off 1 or 2 to give to Australia in theory, but when it comes to the crunch with the president after the next having to make the decision, when the intensification of their rivalry with China has only increased on boat numbers, submarine numbers, it's inconceivable that a US president will say, that's okay, we will forego these nuclear arms subs to keep this agreement with Australia. And somewhere in Washington, they'll be using the Kurt Campbell style argument. Don't worry about the Australians. They'll cop anything we serve up to them. We'll get out some new bunting and we'll call this AUKUS version 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And those gullible idiots down there will lap it up and defend it. And by the way, we'll throw in some wording about how their crews will be on our vessels, and we'll say, this is the pooling of sovereignty. It is American submarines being based in Australian ports. That's what AUKUS Mark 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the early 2030s will be. Well, you haven't quite got the subs we planned in the first version of AUKUS, but we've got something even better. You're going to have 8 nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered American submarines, and boy, oh boy, have you got a deal, because we're going to allow you to put your crews on those vessels. That's what it's going to end up as. You can see it clearly. You can see it in the congressional research papers that sort of canvass this option. You can see it in the comments of a Kurt Campbell. You can see it in the gullibility of Australian supporters of AUKUS who are sort of qualifying all the more heavily their expectations of AUKUS. Even the Americans are saying, well, this can be made to work, or there's no reason why this can't work, which is not a full-bodied endorsement. Their language has become very weak and very qualified. So that's what will happen with AUKUS. But in the meantime, colossal loss of Australian sovereignty. We got submarines in the early 60s, the Oberon class. We've had our own sovereign submarine capacity since then. But as the Collins class are retired, and they are pretty old in the 2030s, and there's no AUKUS submarine emerge, just American subs based in our ports, what does that mean? We used to have subs that we could say were Australian, operated by Australians, at the command of Australians. We now will no longer have that capacity. And in the meantime, under the present government, we've militarised Northern Australia. I said in this forum at the Minerals Institute, I said, we've got the stationing of B-52s in Northern Australia. Their only mission is to attack China, and specifically Chinese nuclear facilities that give China a second strike capacity in the event of war. So you think of the wisdom of Paul Keating, who said on one occasion in this debate, China would have no reason to attack Australia were it not that we put our hand up to host US facilities aimed right at China. No one can make a case for us having nuclear subs without the assumption being invoked we have them to engage with America in a war on China. We could have had French subs in the water at any time, 100%. 100% of them engaged in the water at any time, making this continent inviolable, impossible to damage. We've gone for subs from America, nuclear armed, as Gareth Evans, nuclear powered, that Gareth Evans said earlier this week, could well have only 2 available to us at any time, the rest in maintenance or repair. No one could say they've got a function other than to commit us with America in a war on China. Well, I say unreservedly that Australia joining a war on China over Taiwan Strait or South China Sea is not in this country's interest. I'm under no illusions about the Marxist-Leninist dictatorship in China. The language I would have used as I would be using as foreign minister when it comes to the Uyghurs, human rights, legal autonomy in Hong Kong, the need for a peaceful resolution in and about the Taiwan Strait, and the adherence to international law on the South China Sea is exactly the same as we used under a coalition government. My issue of difference is that Australia diplomacy, in my view, should be directed at building, nurturing the idea of détente between China and the US. If détente could be created, cultivated, nurtured in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan, and before that by Kissinger and Gerald Ford, between America and the now deceased Soviet Union, it's not too hard a concept to apply to the relations between a rising power with a lot of problems, a lot of restraints, China, and the prevailing power, the US. Instead, we're going along implicitly with the American phobia about defending its primacy in Asia. This administration doesn't use the term primacy. Previous one did. It's a dangerous concept because anything that happens in Asia could be interpreted by a jittery, paranoid, anxious America as an attack on their primacy. What is primacy? We don't know. It can be anything. And Australia is doing nothing to indicate that we're cautioning America against a paranoid approach to defending a position in Asia that can't be defended any longer. In 1996, when there was tension over Taiwan Strait, America was able to send battleships through the Taiwan Strait. If it did today, there'd be a risk, in theory at least, that Chinese supersonic missiles could sink those vessels. There's no prospect of that. In 1996, the balance of power has changed. Australia should be a very diplomatic, very discreet, but a very persistent advocate of a détente. And we'd be engaging with the bulk of opinion in the ASEAN world, were we to do that. ASEAN, leave aside the Philippines as an exception because it's been the victim of assertive behaviour by China. But the rest of ASEAN wants to see cooperation between and a minimisation of conflict and rivalry between the US and China. We should be there with the Singapores and the Malaysias and the Indonesians and the others, even Vietnam with its maritime territorial disputes with China. Yep. That's my approach. So to sum up, we're going to watch AUKUS fail. In the meantime, it'll be a huge waste and a massive pressure on the budget. And for those interested in defence strategies, involve, in effect, as someone in Canberra said to me the other day, the abolition of the Australian Army, because we simply cannot afford the colossal cost of AUKUS and the meeting of other defence requirements that are quite legitimate, drones, missiles, the rest. Second, I just emphasise that we have got an alternative posture to defend and promote, and that's the embrace of a détente between rising power and prevailing power. And they're notions that I think, Keith, we can discuss and elaborate on at this conference. The prospect of war between these two powers is grotesque. The chances of it degenerating into a nuclear exchange are about as high as you could imagine And we know that would be an extinction of civilization, and certainly the end of US and the end of Chinese civilization and world leadership as we understand it. It'd be a new world order, and for the supporters of the West, not a very pleasant one, a world dominated by Iran, Russia, and India. A nuclear war would be a catastrophe.
Please join with me in thanking Bob for that stimulating introduction and helping to set out the problem. And we'll come back to questions after all the presenters. So our next speaker is Karina Lester, an Indigenous woman from the northwest of South Australia, and she grew up in the remote community of Mamili in the Everett Ranges. Karina currently works for the mobile language team as Aboriginal co-manager and senior Aboriginal language worker at the University of Adelaide, supporting the Aboriginal languages of South Australia in revival, maintenance and reclamation programs. Karina is also a keen anti-nuclear activist, sharing not only her late father, Yami Lester's story, but her grandmother's story of the British nuclear tests in the 1950s and 1960s. For our overseas audience, and we've got at least 100 people online, we had British nuclear tests taking place in South Australia in the 1950s and 60s, as well as off the coast of Western Australia. And she speaks strongly about the impacts felt by her people. Her recent works have been with the Nobel Peace Prize Award recipients, ICAN, which is the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, the UN treaty negotiations for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the South Australian Royal Commission into International Waste Storage Facility, and the National Waste Storage Facility We Say No campaign. And in 2008, Karina joined the list of ICAN ambassadors, and she flew in last night from Adelaide. So please welcome Karina. Thank you, Karina.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. I didn't realise the slides were going to be sort of shining on our faces, so I apologise for that. But thank you all for coming and hearing the story, and it's just a small story of what happened to Arnor in particular, which is the term that I'll use through this presentation because it's the language of that Western Desert region in Bidyanyatja and Yankunytjatja language, which was the community that was impacted. But before I continue on any further on my presentation, I do want to acknowledge that I am on the country of the Gadigal people, from the Eora Nation. I'm visiting. I'm from the Arnor Bidyanyatja and Yankunytjatja lands in South Australia, which is in the far north west of South Australia. And I've travelled and flew in last night to be part of this event to talk a little bit of the truth telling from us as Arnor. And so my presentation is using words in our language as well. And so hashtag #BigOea is the hashtag #NoWar2024. And I wanted to just honour this presentation of my late father, Yami Lester. He was a leader in really talking up about the history of what happened in the 1953 it was the first mainland test that took place on our country, on the Yankunytjatja people's country in South Australia. Totem 1 was the first mainland test that had the impact over the community in Dad's area there on Yankunytjatja country. And so that's where Dad felt the ground shake and the black mist roll that fell over the Arnor people who were there at that time. It was a pastoral property and many people were working on that pastoral property. And so that's why there was this population of Arnor living and working there that felt that first impact then. And many of them suffered. I hear stories from my great-grandparents, dying because of the high toxic radiation fallout with that black cloud that fell over community and over our traditional lands. People became quite sick. Nana had rashes and skin rashes, and also many people suffered from blindness, which is in Dad's story. In his case, 4 years after that mainland test, he became blinded. And so his world changed dramatically. where he turned, his world into darkness. He was a young boy at that time, and I'm a mother of 4, and I have beautiful 2 boys who are around the same age that Dad was. So around 16 was when Dad's world completely changed. And I see that in my son, my youngest son, William, where I think how horrific and traumatic it would be as a young boy growing up on your traditional land, speaking your language, practicing your law and your culture, and being a part of knowing your role and responsibility as a young Arnongal man to then completely changing to this world of darkness. And so that's part of the trauma that is carried by many Arnongal who have lived and who have this lived experience from what happened on actions that we had no control of. There was no consent by Arnongal. No one came and spoke to Arnongal and said, we're about to conduct these tests. I believe they had one patrol officer that was responsible for covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometres in South Australia to inform Arnongal in English. But Arnongal spoke Pidgin-Yatta and Yankunyatja language. So there was not at all any consultation to the First Nations peoples, to Arnongal around what was about to happen, what was going to be conducted, and what these tests really meant, and Australia's role and play in the whole testing program that took place in the 50s and 60s. So Arnongal had no idea. And then on that day, on the 15th of October, 1953, that was the morning that that ground shook and the black mist rolled over country, contaminating country, but also sickening our people as well. And Dad's story was really important through after 30 years in that Royal Commission. So 1953, it took 30 years before we were able to have a Royal Commission into the British nuclear testing program, which took place in the 80s then, in the early 1980s. And Dad was part of that. As we all know, part of that program, that testing program, moved down to Maralinga-Yarrowdja, and there at Maralinga-Yarrowdja, they continued to test. And so they continued to contaminate and test their weapons in country that's almost a third of the state of South Australia, a very large area of our state of South Australia. The next slide is honouring my elders and my grandmothers before me, because many of these women here, the Gubba-Bridi Gunga-Yurra, who were quite active in the campaign against a waste dump, a nuclear waste dump. So not only testing on our traditional lands, but also wanting to dump nuclear waste on our traditional lands. And these amazing women were such leaders. All of them, except one, has now passed. The lady standing on the left-hand side, Gummy Emily Austin, is still with us, very elderly now, living in Coober-Pedy. And Gubba-Bridi is the Coober-Pedy women who were strong and staunch in their campaign against a nuclear waste dump in South Australia. But that pressure still continues, And one of the big things I learned through this campaign work when Nanamob were running the Iradiwandi campaign was the fact that it was not only an Arnongal issue. This issue concerned all of us, all Australians, on this waste and how do we manage nuclear waste. The solution from the experts out there is to dig a hole and stick it in the ground. Arnongal say no. And that's been part of my journey as the next generation, from these amazing old women and to Dad and his story to myself now, continuing to share those stories about we say no around nuclear testing and nuclear dumping and nuclear mining, which is a big part of South Australia as well. The next slide shows a little bit of some of the locations of where they have happened, or where they're mining and where those test sites are. So you can see Emu, which is the area of the first mainland test, but then you can also see Maralinga. So it's a fairly large area of the state of South Australia. You see active mines that are currently there operating, where they're mining uranium from our traditional lands, and these are traditional lands of other nations in South Australia on Gugga country, which are people from the mid-north Port Augusta region and north of Port Augusta as well. You also see where there are deposits held in certain places as well. the picture is quite ugly when you look at it, and you can see all the nuclear activity, whether it's testing or mining or storing. And we have also Woomera that is there, part of a huge struggle for Guga the people and that particular nation there, because it's sits right within their area. But a part of that Woomera prohibited area does also straddle out into the Arnongo, Bidjanyara and Yankunytjatjara lands as well. I was recently travelling down the highway, and I was talking to Uncle Ray about this. As I was travelling down south, army trucks were mobilising north, past Woomera, so heading, must be up to Darwin, doing what they need to do, or doing, you know, what they are planned or ordered to do, which is pretty much what happened when you think of the 1950s and 60s. People were ordered, veterans and those who served the country were ordered at that time of when the tests were taking place as well. So people are mobilising. We are seeing these things, and we are hearing these things as well, that, you know, Woomera is being upgraded, army trucks are travelling up the highway. So South Australia's story is a really ugly story in that they mine, they've tested, and now they still pressure us on the nuclear waste dump as well. And that's been a huge debate for many of our First Nations peoples in South Australia as well. It's an ongoing generational nuclear injustice for us First Nations peoples of the state of South Australia, let alone, if we know our history, mining has been also operating up in the Northern Territory as well, but there has been some success in that story as well, with closing of the Jabiluka mine as well, finally, after many decades of that. There is no plan when it comes to nuclear waste, and you hear stories. You know, there is no textbook when there is a nuclear plant eruption or explosion. There is no plan of how to manage that. It's a huge issue. As I said, we come from a lived experience. It is First Nations peoples, Arnongo in our case of South Australia, but also it is veterans who were there at those times, feeling the forces of those blasts as well. Once a veteran's daughter said to me that the onus is always on us to keep this story alive and ongoing, to keep reminding and going through those emotions as well of the trauma that has been touched on us, that we carry through generations as well. So Indigenous peoples know that nuclear is not the answer. We know that war is not the answer. It's important for us Indigenous peoples across this entire nation to get together to really voice our concerns, because many of us are wearing scars of that nuclear testing, but our country and our traditional lands are wearing those scars as well. And they are two major areas that we're very concerned about on how we need to look after country and people as well. I think my next slide is just really a quote that I wanted to end by reading from Dad. It's a classic photo of Yami sitting on the veranda on his traditional lands at Wallatina, which is the very area that cloud and that ground shook and that black mist rode. And so he says here, we heard it here, loud and clear, and felt the ground shake. We've seen the radiation fall out over our camp. It was moving quietly, and very deadly. And Nana's recollection of that day was that this black mist that fell over country was very toxic. There was a smell to that country, to that cloud that fell over country, but it also left like a sticky, black, sooty substance over our country as well. Our plants were impacted, which is the food sources that we hunt and gather, but also our people were impacted by this as well. It's important to keep this story alive and ongoing, because as I said, the veteran's daughter said it's always up to us to keep the story alive, to make sure that people know the truth around what happened back then in the 1950s and 1960s, but also the way that it impacted on us First Nations people, or Arnongo in this particular case. And so when you look at a map of that South Australian map, you can see all that area there in Western eyes, was no man's land. No one existed in their eyes. But to Anō, it was our traditional lands, country that we have intangible cultural heritage that crisscrosses through that teaches us our roles and our responsibilities of our country and our traditional areas. There are craters there now. There are many craters in that area there. That's what nuclear has taken away from us, our intangible cultural heritage. We will never get that back, but it's also taken away our loved ones and our people. No justice has been done. There's been no apology to the First Nations peoples by the British government. There are things that we need to sit down and we need to be part of these solutions as we go forward as well. Aboriginal people are often left out. When I did the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, it was very important for us to be part of that, because 300 jurors in that process were going to make a decision on whether we as South Australia was going to be the waste dump of the world. And so First Nations peoples needed to be right there. And that was the campaign that we led. The We Say No campaign was very strong as First Nations peoples of South Australia, and also networking with our fellow First Nations members across our nation as well, to stand strong in solidarity to say no to the international waste dump. And that was done through a very political process, whereas we come from a completely different world as First Nations peoples. Our world is connected through our knowledge of our stories, knowledge of our country, passed down through our language, passed down by our elders as well for generations and generations. And I'm part of that generational story, but moving in two worlds. Cultural obligations that I need to follow, but also a very Western political royal commissions and processes that we need to be involved in as well. And part of that work is also led through the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And that's part of my role as an ambassador as well, to continue to share those stories, but to talk about environment and people, and that First Nations peoples exist, and we are here, and we want to be part of the solution, and we need to be part of that solution as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity.
Great. Thanks so much indeed, Karina. Our third speaker is Peter Cronau. Peter is an award-winning investigative journalist, writer and filmmaker. His documentary, The Base, Pine Gap's Role in United States War Fighting, was featured on ABC television. He is the co-editor of the book A Secret Australia, revealed by WikiLeaks exposés. So, Peter, over to you.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation for where we're having this meeting today, and to pay respects to the elders who are present, as well as present and forthcoming elders. One of the questions is, why is the United States so interested in Australia? Well, it's been said a couple of times. I'll give just two examples. One, Douglas MacArthur, who was commander of Pacific Forces during World War II, came to Australia and met with the War Cabinet and said to them, "We're not animated by any warm friendship with Australia." His words. He said, "We're interested in Australia as its utility as a base." Now, that opinion isn't just an old one. It's been repeated again by another high-ranking US commander who was doing what no one in this room was able to do, and that is visiting Pine Gap. 2 years ago, the commander of the US Space Command was there. He was asked by a British reporter, no Australian reporters turned up. He was asked by a British reporter, why are you so interested in Australia? And he grinned and said, location, location, location. Now, why is Australia interested in having the United States here? Because successive governments have been extremely welcoming to the United States. Well, The first major US base set up post-World War II in Australia was at Northwest Cape, a nuclear submarine communications base was set up there. It was set up, the original agreement was 1963. 63 is an interesting year because that is the year that it was the first time Australia ever requested US military support under the ANZUS Treaty. We were becoming involved in a war with Indonesia by supporting the British, as we always do, in Malaya and Borneo. We asked the United States to join us and to help us out. They refused point blank under the ANZUS Treaty, the president at the time, Kennedy. Incidentally, it was again with Indonesia, we requested, the second time we requested assistance under ANZUS, and that was 1999 regarding East Timor. The Americans, they eventually provided some logistical and intelligence support, but refused numbers of boots on the ground. So what is it Australia gets out of it? Well, we're getting a lot of new bases at the moment. We're getting a lot of expansions of all the present bases that are going. I've written about Pine Gap. Just in the last couple of years, we've seen it expand to 45 satellite dishes on the ground just outside of Alice Springs. 3 years ago, there was 35. So those 10 additional dishes have been built, a huge investment. Pine Gap has got 3 real purposes. It's not that complicated. It collects SIGINT, which is intelligence electronically transmitted from all over the world, whether it be mobile phones of somebody in Lebanon, through to emails sent. They can target, if they have an IP address, they can target mobile phones. They can find out and record and process and analyse and pass on to our allies any of that signals intelligence. Another one is obviously photographic intelligence, not such an important one, but still important. There's also dishes that are set up for spying on commercial satellites. There's about, I think, 400 commercial satellites spinning around the world, and there's a series of dishes set up. One of them is in Alice Springs, and it illegally, obviously, sucks up commercial intelligence from commercial satellites, including telephone calls, but also including information between governments and private companies, resource companies. So by tapping into that, it gives a very big advantage to the United States in collecting that information for itself. The 10 extra dishes that have just been completed building at Pine Gap were not announced by the Australian government that I've been able to find. They were not discussed in Parliament. They were not approved by the local council formally, officially. They were not discussed in any regional council meetings. They've just been built. And it reminds me of what Karina was saying, that what happened in South Australia was done without consent. Well, I think that parallel today with the building of US bases in Australia is largely done without public consent. So the Pine Gap expansion, 3 of the dishes are huge dishes. You can see them on Google Earth if you want to go and have a look. They're on the western perimeter of the base. 3 of them lined up. They had to bulldoze the spinifex out of the way to build these. What they are there for is a new series of satellites that the US is about to launch. It's supposed to be this year, but looks like it's going to be next year. And they are infrared detection. Infrared satellite detection satellites are very important because they can pick up launches of missiles. They can pick up jet engines. They can pick up lots of things. They're extraordinarily sensitive, huge collectors out in space when they unfold their antenna. And what that does is gives extremely detailed information about a launch location, the type of missile being launched, the direction, the trajectory, the speed, the warhead. All that information is collected very, very quickly, which gives an advantage to the United States to be able to take out that site to stop any more missiles being launched. Most people would say, oh, that's good, we can be safe. But unfortunately, what that does is intimidates China to the point where it believes that it is so likely to have its sites taken out by an extremely powerful United States that, as Des Ball has said to me in the past, China may well decide it's got one shot in its arsenal. And if it doesn't do severe damage to America in the first couple of hours, then it ain't going to survive as a country, if it comes to that. Now, so that's been built. Now, Paul Dibb, who's a very respected Australian defence scholar and expert, has made a statement about Pine Gap, and he said it is certain that it is going to be one of the first sites that China will attack in any nuclear war. It's the eyes and ears for the United States in this region. So the risk is enormous, but it's not only Pine Gap. There's dozens of other locations that the United States uses around Australia, and we can just work around the coastline. We've got Codgerina outside Geraldton. Originally, it was a satellite communications station, which the Australians used. It was useful to have that sort of station, but now built onto it, the United States have added to it. They've added secure network for military mobile phones, data, video, which is used, in battlefields, and they've added a massive data communication centre with 10 satellite dishes, which is allows them to direct and target drones, for example, attacking a location. Then there's Northwest Cape. Northwest Cape, as I said before, has the submarine communications, but they've also had a bit of new building going on out there recently. Exmouth and Learmouth are two towns adjacent to Northwest Cape, and they've both had an expansion. There's now a United States space telescope that's been built, which can actually optically zoom into stationary satellites that are in orbit, but in stationary orbit. They're so far out that they travel at the same speed as the Earth rotation, and monitor them and look at their behaviour and look at their type. And just near that is another space radar, which detects low orbit satellites. Now, the reason they're doing that is so they can take them out if there's a war, or even before a war. Take them out either by their own attack satellites or by electronic pulses of various kinds. There's lots of research being done, including in Australia, on how to take out those sorts of satellites. So these are active war-fighting bases. They're not surveillance bases. We don't really have surveillance, but there's surveillance going on, of course, but they're war-fighting bases. Travelling further north from, obviously with Learmouth, there's an airport which is being expanded. Up at Darwin, we've got the Darwin Airport. Four Corners did a program on it just recently, and it's developing a squadron's operation facility for the B-52 bombers. So that's accommodation, refueling, tarmac, and it'll work in conjunction with Tyndall, which has space for 6 bombers at a time, including space for armaments and refueling. And these are only being built to fight a war. They're only being built to fight a war. The planes, if they get off the ground and don't get attacked first, will be launching cruise missiles from far offshore from China. That's what they are planned to do. Some excellent research, by the way, has been done on this by Richard Tanter, and I commend his recent report, which looks at just this thing, the nuclear fighting ability of the B-52 bombers and why they're in Australia. Darwin also has the Robertson Barracks, 200 Marines initially, but it's the boiling frog example. Now it's up to 2,500 Marines. It's described as a rotational deployment. However, President Obama, when he was here and met with Julia Gillard, discussed the base as being an enduring presence. So any suggestion it's a temporary base, we should abandon. It's a permanent US military Marines base. Across at Perth. I forgot Perth. There's so much going on in Western Australia. Sterling, HMAS Sterling has obviously been targeted for 30 odd years. Various defence think tanks and defence organisations in the US have been saying they wanted Sterling for their Indian Ocean base for their fleet. Well, they're doing it again by the boiling frog. They're going to put some subs there. It's gradually turning into the US fleet base in Australia. We should be aware that it's not the first thing they start with. It's what the eventual plan is. Then moving down, we've got the airport in Darwin, we've got Tyndall, but also Sherga, Curtin and Learmouth are having massive extensions in terms of hangars, the size of the runway, refueling ability. On top of that, there's other airports that are being prepared, just basically having their tarmacs fixed. And this is part of what I call the ACE base. ACE is Agile Combat Employment Airports. They're being scattered around the region at the moment by the US because in a war, they know their bases are going to be bombed. They need airstrips to land their planes. So they're also working extra emergency land strips all over the place, all their little islands in the Marianas and various locations. The old World War II strips are being re-tarmacked. Likewise, that's happening in Australia. Cocos Islands. Forever, governments have said, oh, no, we'll never. In fact, I think the Cocos Island Agreement that signed with the United Nations says that there will be no military use of the islands. Well, I'm sorry, but the US Navy's just opened up a contract for building a wharf there. The airport is also being extended by the Australians. We're paying for that. And an American person in charge of the contract distribution made an odd statement saying that at present there's no plans for any Marines to be based there. So try to find out information from the Defence Minister in Australia about any of this and you'll reach a dead end. Now, Bungendore, outside of Canberra, a lovely spot. It's also the headquarters for the Joint Operations Command of Australia. Based there are Americans, of course, as liaison officers inside the command centre for all Australian military, liaising. American presence is everywhere. The Defence Intelligence Organisation in Canberra, the basing of Americans there is now complete. A combined intelligence centre has been established inside the Defence Intelligence Organisation. And it was described by Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, as allowing an American perspective being able to be given to the American system as seen from Australia. Not much talk about utility for Australians. As well as that, we've got pre-positioning of US military equipment, 350 odd vehicles parked at, under huge hangars in Victoria. Plus dozens and dozens of containers containing equipment. We've got pre-positioning of equipment in Queensland. Another whole area which occupies one sentence of my talk is the manufacturing base. We're now becoming a base for the manufacture of US armaments. Yes, they may well be used by Australia, but they're being produced for the United States, including, ultimately, hypersonic weapons. So, as well as that, we are given pretty open access to the United States through the Force Posture Agreement, which gives exclusive access to some locations in Australia. Think of that word, exclusive, to United States military and their contractors. As well as that, the Status of Forces Agreement gives requests Australia to give logistical support to Americans and agents of US military forces, which is the way it's put, in Australia. That will include assisting American transition and temporary storage of nuclear weapons in Australia. The word storage won't be used. It's too sensitive. It'll be called transition. And those weapons will be moving through Australia, through either naval vessels or through the planes. We won't be told. In New Zealand, it's been a requirement, and that's why they've stopped doing it. But we won't be told. Richard Tanter again has shown photographs of the B-52s that are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. They have a particular piece of equipment on the outside of the plane, which enables Australians to look over the fence at the airport and work out which ones are nuclear capable, because there won't be in any press release. Instead, what we're getting are star-spangled kangaroos. Star-spangled kangaroos complete with brass bands and twerking dance troupes. That's the level of what the Australian public is being treated with in this absolutely, of course, unprecedented military build-up that's going on at the moment, with no say, with no information, unless you scratch around and try to find out yourself, a lot of it only available in the United States. My final point is that we're an occupied nation and we need to take control again. We need a government who's prepared to say no, and we need a government that is prepared to genuinely discuss these issues with the Australian people through Parliament, but elsewhere, through forums, by being interviewed, go on Q&A and talk about it. You know, it's not a secret, it's buried, but it's not a secret. This information should be shared with all Australians. Otherwise, our democracy is worth, I'm not sure what. Thank you.
Thanks so much indeed, Peter. And our final speaker, joining us from Canberra, the national capital, is Dr. Sue Wareham, who has spoken and written widely on peace and disarmament issues, and is president of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War in Australia, and a board member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And Dr. Wareham is a former Canberra general practitioner, and she'll be joining us online.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes,
James, I don't actually need the slides right now, but you can leave it up if that's easier. Anyway, hello to all, and it's very good to be here. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm speaking, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I speak, the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. So what I plan to say will be a little bit action orientated. So I appreciate what we've heard from previous speakers, which has been extremely helpful. And I hope what I have to say might lead into subsequent discussions about some actions. So I'm going to start by stating that what we know very well, which is that militarism in Australia at the moment is all about preparing us for US-led wars, and the current threat, of course, being a major and catastrophic war against China. And we need to push back against every aspect of this, and I'll be talking about one aspect in which we can push back. I'm going to talk about our education system. That's what I've been asked to address. And in 10 minutes, I'll just be making a few points. The inroads of militarism into our education system are at all levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary. I'll be talking mostly about primary and secondary, that's our schools, partly because the militarisation in our universities is so vast, one could not even begin to address it in this short time, but also because exposing primary and secondary students to the influence of weapons companies, which is what I'll be talking about, is particularly egregious. So I'm going to start by stating the obvious, which is that wars and preparations for wars can't occur without weapons, and the production of weapons is a highly profitable business. The biggest players in the weapons industry in Australia are disproportionately US multinational corporations. And in the rankings, the most recent rankings of SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, of the top weapons producing companies in the world, the top 5 of them are all based in the United States. And those in order are Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons company in the world, then Raytheon Technologies, then Northrop Grumman, then Boeing, and General Dynamics. So they're the top 5 weapons companies in the world, and they're all US multinationals. And all of them have a presence in Australia in some form or another. Now, the industry wants to ensure that it grows, that it thrives, that it has a good future, and for that it needs wars and it needs preparations for wars. In order to grow and thrive, the industry recognise that they need to capture the best. What they want to do is to capture the best young scientific minds in the country, and not just science, but all the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And that's an explicit goal from a number of the weapons companies, that they want the best young scientific minds that Australia has to offer. To do this, the industry has to present itself in a very sanitised way. They need to obscure what their products actually do when the products are used as intended. And they need to push all the right buttons for a young audience. So they use words like exciting, cutting-edge technology, jobs of the future, all of this. They have images of glamour and fun, and so on and so forth. They particularly target young females. The goal of the industry is to create positive associations. And for young people, children, this would most often be happy memories of something that the company presented. It might come, and it will come from exposure to a particular brand name. I'll go through these slides in a moment, but have a look at all the blue T-shirts here, all of them Lockheed Martin T-shirts, and have a look at how young some of these student participants are. So the goal is to expose kids and youth to particular brand names, so that there's an awareness of the brand name and the development of some sort of attachment to that particular brand name. We know that children are particularly vulnerable to this process of brand exposure, and in fact they should receive a particular protection from marketing communications that are directed at them. But what we see instead is the opposite. We know that, excuse me, children as young as 3 years old can recognise brand names, and from about the age of 7, they can form brand preferences. Even into adolescence, children don't have the skills, youth don't have the skills to critically assess what they're being fed, the intentions behind the marketing, or to understand what the brand really represents, or to understand the implications of work that the company does. So what the industry offers for student schools are a whole range of things: exhibitions, educational materials, competitions, sponsorships, camps, and a whole range of other things. And because our public school system is grossly underfunded, if the educational material looks good, which it generally does, then we certainly can't blame our teachers for taking it up. So what I want to emphasise is the problem is not so much the content of the programs, but the problem is the brand name association that goes with it. It's a foot in the door for the industry. The problem of the industry targeting young people goes beyond our schools. I'm going to mention an example from Australia, of course, of NYSF, which is the National Youth Science Forum. And it's our premier organisation for encouraging young scientists, and they work with kids from year 12 and beyond. Now, the primary sponsor of NYSF is Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons maker in the world. The problem, of course, is not confined to private companies, but also government. And one example of that is in 2023, last year, our Federal Defence Department launched the Nuclear Submarine Propulsion Challenge, a competition for students from years 7 through to 12. So that's basically the end of primary school right through high school, to encourage these young people to aspire to a future career in the nuclear submarine program. And all of this has got huge implications. And one of the risks, of course, being narrowing the field of STEM away from critically needed areas of scientific research in health, environmental care, climate action, and a whole host of other things. So let's have a look at quick run through these slides now. We've seen that first one. Next one, James, please. We'll just run through these pretty quickly. Just a few examples. This is Naval Group, another weapons company. This is actually a collaboration with the government of New South Wales. And again, look at how young these kids are. Next one, please. Raytheon has a big program called Maths Alive. Now have a look at this promo for it. It's all about excitement. How could a kid resist that? That's their maths program. And you see the Raytheon brand name there, right in the middle. Next one, please, James. BAE Systems. This one I put up to illustrate the young age which the company targets. They target kids down to the age of about 3 or 4 years, kids who are reading fairy stories. Have a look up if you want to see more of this BAE Systems fairy tales. And again, the problem is not the content of it, but the problem is BAE Systems name all over it. Next one, please. And just another one from the same series from BAE Systems. Alrighty. This is National Youth Science Forum. And again, look at the Lockheed Martin branding all over it. Next one, please. Thank you. This is a report which MAPW, Medical Association for Prevention of War, have done on this problem. Sorry. So I put that up to prompt you to have a look at that report on our website if you'd like to read more about this. Next one, please. In the interest of time, I'll just let you read that quickly. These are a couple of quotes from the Murdoch publication in Adelaide. So there we have it. The economic future of our state and our kids is riding on building a workforce to service a future generation of nuclear submarines. This is crazy, another planet sort of stuff. Next one, please. Although that might be the last, I think. Is there another one, James? Yeah, we'll skip over that one. Address that. Okay. Let's have some good news. Teachers for Peace, a newish group that started up in Australia. And you can guess what they're about. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at the Teachers for Peace website. Thank you. That's all. So I don't know if we can revert to me, but if we leave that slide up, that's okay. Okay. So what can we do about it? Well, there's actually a lot that we can do. The approach that our organisation has taken in Australia and others as well is to make sure that state and territory education department policies recognise the harm caused by the weapons industry and therefore deem them unsuitable as partners for schools to partner with. Just as education departments state that it's unsuitable for schools to partner with companies associated with alcohol, tobacco, gambling, all the rest of it, we are urging state education departments to state that the weapons industry also are unsuitable partners for schools. And we've had some success in some of the states in changing education department policies. And that's really, really encouraging. I want to mention also that the New South Wales Teachers Federation have done terrific work in this area also, and unions elsewhere. So, and the passage of resolutions by education unions stating their opposition to all this sort of stuff that we've been talking about. Once education departments have good policy in place, which a number of them now do, the next part, which is a little trickier, is to see what's happening on the ground and to make sure that the policy is being complied with. And here we really need people on the ground, teachers, parents, etc., who see what's happening in the schools. And if there's something, a program happening which shouldn't be happening, a partnership with a weapons company, then we need to call it out and raise awareness about that. So I think there's some work that all of us could get involved in there. The final thing I'm just going to say very quickly is that, yes, I'm sorry I haven't had time to talk about universities. The problem in the universities is vast. I'm just going to mention that on October 11, our organisation will be hosting a debate at Melbourne University, which will be live streamed, so watch our website for details of that. And the topic of the debate will be, is it ethical for universities to divest in and work with companies that produce weapons? So this is, given the controversy that has risen around this issue in relation to weapons to Israel, this is going to be an important event, I think. So thank you all, and I will leave it there.
Please stay on the line, Sue, if we can get the technology to work. Could I invite the other speakers to come up, please? We've got about half an hour. So we've got Bob, Karina. So I thank the speakers for sticking to time. It's given us half an hour for question and answer. For those who are watching online, please send your questions through on Q&A, and our IT team will relay them, and we'll be able to include them in our discussion. So perhaps I can get the ball rolling by a question to Bob. Why didn't the Albanese government, when they came to power, try to get out of the AUKUS deal?
Why didn't they?
Why didn't they? What were the obstacles to doing that?
This doesn't work.
It doesn't work, James. Sorry, we've got technology problems.
Okay. That's a very good question. I don't know. I thought it was understandable that the Labor Party in opposition wanted to close this down and not gift Morrison with what he was seeking, a wedge issue. But I would have thought that would have made it entirely credible for Labor after the election to have said, look, we found this notion an interesting idea, but we're just going to, we find very little details in the files, and we're going to have a short, sharp inquiry into the opportunity cost of going for nuclear subs. That would have been credible, and it would have presented the government with many opportunities to have said, we're reconsidering and we're going back to the deal with France. I don't know why they didn't, but Prime Minister Albanese was off within days of becoming Prime Minister to do a meeting of the Quad. And I think the atmospherics were such that he didn't have the confidence to take a stand, even though I thought that would have been one very, very easily justified in a conversation with the Australian public.
Do you have any other questions from the floor or from online? James has got some questions.
Yeah, I've got one from online, and this came earlier from Randy Hicks in Sacramento, California. And Randy was essentially asking about where the UN is in all of this, and he was asking about when's the next UN peace conference, or when was the last one. Yes, I guess this is a general question about where does the UN sit in all of this as the world seems to be sliding more and more towards a violent future? What are they doing?
Look, could I leap in and say I think the UN is disabled by the veto power that resides in the US Charter, in the UN Charter. So in dealing with Ukraine, which is an act of aggression by Russia, it's compromised by the Russian veto. America has a veto and has generally used it when it comes to any criticism of Israel. Our great Dr. Revitt at the San Francisco conference was pressing the case for more rights for smaller nations in the UN Charter, but the UN Charter ended up being a historic compromise. The UN will have a role in peace and security, but it would have no power of intervention in internal affairs, and more important, it would grant the victors, the great powers of World War II, a veto right, so their interests would not be compromised by an international consensus that hurt them in some way.
Sue, I'm trying to interpret your hand movements. You do want to speak. Sue Wareham from Canberra.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, that's an important question about the United Nations. I just wanted to add to what Bob has said. Absolutely correct about the veto power being a huge problem. I think when people criticise the United Nations for not being able to end the wars that we're seeing, we need to put the spotlight on the UN member states, not the UN Secretariat or any other aspect of it. And I personally would hate to live in a world without the UN doing what the UN and all its organisations are doing at the moment in relation, for example, to Gaza. The UN Secretary General and agencies have been absolutely right out in front in trying to get a cessation of the shocking violence that's going on there. So when people talk about the United Nations, I think we need to put the onus back on the UN member states and look at which member states are totally undermining the work of the United Nations. Thanks.
More questions, James, coming in from overseas?
Yeah, they are starting to come in, but I'm going to abuse my privilege because I want to ask Karina a question at this point. And it relates to the way in which layers of sovereignty are stripped away. Like there has been a parallel drawn in the presentations this morning about the experience that you had and that your people had, and then what the country is also experiencing now with the way that, as Peter was laying out so extensively, how Australia's sovereignty is also being trampled on. So what's your experience of that from where you sit?
Goodness me, that's a really tough question because that's what I've grown up into. You know, that's been part of my whole life experiences of all this sovereignty being stripped away from us, the undermining of the cultural knowledge and us as Arnongal people in this country. From day that I was born, and it's been an ongoing struggle, and it continues to be an ongoing struggle for many of us Indigenous peoples across this nation. Have a look at the referendum last year as well. So no more a voice, but again, right there to be the solutions of the problems that are being created by those in power. And that's been very, struggling and very confronting for many of us who are sort of speaking up constantly about our place and our rights, and as Indigenous peoples of this country, let alone around the world, which is part of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is Australia's only a signature to that. And so where are we placed as Indigenous peoples around this world when constantly we are pressured to be solutions to the problems? Waste is an example. Testing of nuclear weapons have been conducted around the globe. And so that's why part of the work with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons is really important, because we're wanting for our countries and countries around the world to sign and ratify this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons for the very reason that we're seeing the conflicts that are happening around the globe, but also, the trauma that is surrounded by that as well. I think, it's very in our face at the moment, and I think it's timely for us to be having these difficult conversations to work through how we find solutions to the problems as well. But it's a human right that we have to be part and be involved in those conversations. And I'm hopeful, you know, as we maneuver through this complex world that we live in and the machinery that we're dealing with as well, that our Indigenous voices around the globe are also being part of those conversations, because we've been impacted from the very beginning on this, you know, what's been happening.
Thank you. Peter, can I just ask you a question? You know, given the Pine Gap is just so vital to the United States, why would most Australians still be unaware that we are hosting such an important base, let alone all the rest of the network to which you referred? Can you move the microphone closer?
Yeah, look, well, most Australians gather their information about the world through media. More so social media these days, thank goodness, because a lot of the banned information, the censored information you can get now. Just put Pine Gap into Twitter and look at all the references people are making to it. But why aren't the media covering it? Because that's the reason. It's beyond me, frankly. I worked inside the ABC for 20 odd years, and I saw the resistance to doing certain sorts of stories, self-censorship, actual censorship. I saw it all. And there are some issues that must not be challenged, and one of them is the US alliance. You are not allowed to go down that path. You can tinker on the edges, you can ask questions generally, but you are not to ask questions about why we can't have our politicians all visit Pine Gap and you know, have the public visit it. Why the hell not? They can cover the screens. You know, they can only take us to some locations, but the Australian people don't know because they're not being told. They're not being told by the Parliament. They're not being told by their local members. They're not being told by the media. You have to scratch around and do it yourself. And that's the importance of media and journalism and independent media, that they're the ones getting it out. I mean, occasionally terrific information comes out. The ABC did a 5-part podcast just recently, and I commend everyone to look at it. I think it was called The Base in the Desert or The Spies in the Desert. Fantastic 5-part, 5 half-hour radio documentary done out of the Alice Springs office because it affects them clearly. The reporter who did that did it because they were motivated. They suddenly thought, well, maybe Alice Springs is a target. So you have to look for it. You have to look for that information because the media, commercial media, pro-establishment media, do not want to touch some issues. I mean, we've got a whistleblower in jail at the moment. When's the last time we saw an article in the mainstream media about the whistleblower on war crimes, David McBride? Some issues just don't get covered. And social media fills that gap. That's why it's the target of all these anti-misinformation, anti-disinformation programs.
Bob, you were foreign minister for a while. How many speeches did you give on Pine Gap?
None. I would have needed the authority of the cabinet to reopen policy on Pine Gap. I would have encountered all the arguments out of the Hawke government's years when the treaties governing the American bases were renegotiated, and we started calling them, very misleadingly, joint facilities. And the argument from those years that Pine Gap underpinned the notion of mutually assured destruction, that by giving America 3/4 of an hour notice of the dispatch of a missile somewhere in Eurasia, we were making it less likely that America would be the subject of a surprise attack, a surprise nuclear attack, and less likely that with confused information, America might unleash a response to what was only a peculiar flight of migratory waterfowl, and not, in fact, the release of a nuclear weapon from a Russian silo. So that was the argument that was put forward strongly and endorsed by Prime Minister Hawke. that we have avoided nuclear war during the Cold War because of the fear of mutually assured destruction, and Pine Gap provided accurate information to America that made less likely an accidental resort to a nuclear weapon. So that's the prevailing doctrine or notion here, and it's why I wasn't motivated in my 18 months as Foreign Minister to reopen this.
Now, the Reverend Ray has got a question. So, Ray, do you want to ask your question? There's a microphone coming over to you now, and then we'll go to, I think there are quite a few online as well. So, Ray?
Okay, yeah, this is to you again, Bob. Look, Indigenous peoples worldwide, we participate in all of these discussions, but we don't have a seat at the table in the global decision-making. How would you help us to get into that particular seat at the table so that we have a say in what happens in our country, on our lands, whether it be here in Australia, the US, New Zealand, or Canada? Indigenous peoples don't have a seat at the table.
Well, Ray, I think that's a very sound question. I recently did a trip through Northern Australia, and I felt every day I was there that this is a glorious part of the Australian continent, suffused with Aboriginal memory, Indigenous memory, First Nations memory. And we have now, within the space of a few years, militarised it and rendered it a nuclear target in a way that it wasn't. I debate these matters in my local Labor Party branch at Maroubra. And I remember saying once, making that argument once, and someone from the branch said, but we're already one because of Pine Gap. And I said, Brian, I don't accept the argument that because we're offering one nuclear target on this continent, we shouldn't work to prevent a range of others being settled in Northern Australia. That's my proposition. And he ended up agreeing with me. It wasn't an argument against my proposition to say, oh, it doesn't matter that we've got B-52 bases and the facilities that Peter in very useful detail outlined, because we've already got Pine Gap. So I think there is room for an Indigenous voice, and I would look at using something that's a very useful initiative of Penny Wong, the establishment of an ambassador, an Australian ambassador on Indigenous.
Now, James, we've got quite a few questions coming in, I see.
Yeah, and we do have a hand raised, but Colin Mitchell has stepped out of frame, so I'm not sure if he's there. Oh, he's back. Colin, will if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask Bob Carr. I mean, I think the idea for détente is really key to preventing war. As part of, shouldn't Australia take steps to prevent a conventional war from going nuclear? We could do that by declaring support for no first use policies for nuclear nations. I know that's something that Gareth Evans is very keen on. And wouldn't that help to prevent some sort of a guardrail in place, put a guardrail in place against the possibility of a conventional war going nuclear, which, as you rightly point out, is a very real risk.
No first use we should be supporting. Bob?
Yes, but we should, we can, and Gareth's advice on this would be very constructive, but we do have limited influence on a great power, a great nuclear power. We shouldn't pretend that our advocacy would shift thinking in the, what I think we can fairly call the deep state in Washington.
Yeah, right.
The American doctrine is not to rule out first use. And one of the best books, useful books on this subject is by Admiral Stavridis and his co-author Ackerman. And it's a novelized treatment describing a situation where in the year 2034, that's the title of the book, 2034, China and America slide into war. And it creates a credible scenario in which America does use nuclear weapons, does initiate a nuclear weapons use in this conflict. And the circumstances are credible, and the fact that a US admiral co-authored the book, someone who'd served in 2 separate naval commands, that is heading aircraft carrier fleets, gives you reason to take it seriously, as does the endorsement the book's received from people like Robert Gates. There's nothing in it that is beyond credibility. It even has the decision to go to war in 2004, sending a nuclear weapon to a Chinese city with a population of 10 million, made by a female president who's under enormous pressure to prove that she's as tough, as hard-nosed on security issues as any of her male predecessors.
Sue, do you want to also
Thank you.
comment?
I would point out that China, that China itself has a no first use policy. So I think that if America also declared no first use, that would at least put a mutual agreement in place. And Australia, I think would help to declare no first use.
Thanks for raising it, and your instincts are altogether correct, Sue, but realism dictates that I say an Australian position would have no impact on how all the personnel and resources of the US deep state in Washington will revisit a long-standing American doctrine.
Sue, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick comment, which I did put in the chat line actually, but I think it's relevant here. One thing which Australia could do and would have control over is this ridiculous and totally demeaning policy of neither confirm nor deny, where we don't even insist on knowing whether the US will bring nuclear weapons into our country on naval vessels or aircraft. That's something that I think we could and should be working for in Australia, to get rid of neither confirm nor deny.
Well, that would mean Australia adopting the position adopted by New Zealand under the David Lange government in the 1980s, doesn't it? We're clear about that.
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
think it might be something you want to advocate. I don't think there's a remotest chance of it being adopted, because I think the Australian government, if a Labor government lurched in that direction, it would immediately be accused of abrogating the US alliance, saying we've got an alliance with a great maritime power, but we're saying they can't have their ships in our ports. That's an abrogation of the alliance, which is why the Labor Party, when Hayden was leader, never said, flirted for a moment under Hayden, but in the end never said it would go the way of David Lange's government. It'd be a huge step for Australia. We're living with the fact that our country has put its hand up to be the most uncritical of American allies. We're living with the fact that opinion in Canberra is that there is no role for our country except the total integration of its defence with those of America. You're living with the fact that the received opinion, the powerful conventional opinion in our capital, is that if America goes to war with China, we have no alternative but to offering our continent up as a nuclear target, because we would go to war as well. You're living with the fact where behind closed doors, people in Australian leadership will anticipate the day when they get a call from an American president and our Prime Minister walks into a cabinet room and says, well, we've really got no alternative. That's what all this is leading to. I rather like this old continent with all the custodianship that has protected its unique ecological diversity, and the stories of the Australian people. And I think this continent's got a lot, and the Australian model's got a lot to interest the world. One area where we don't offer a model is the remotest notion of independence in our strategic position and our destiny. In our national character, there is barely an instinct, barely a gene you can locate that says we see ourselves as independent. On the other hand, the instinct to say we live in constant fear of abandonment, and that is the motivating factor on both sides of politics: fear of abandonment, the sense that we've got no alternative, we've got to be the closest of American allies. That is overpowering, and it's frightening. It's sort of an abrogation of our whole history as a nation. The fact that we're prepared to say we are comparable to a US territory. The old joke that we might be the 51st state is sort of understated. We would be more comfortable with the status, not of a state, but of Puerto Rico, a US territory, or some state in Micronesia. It's striking to me that with all our history, our white history, and the legacy of Indigenous custodianship, with all this to draw on, there is barely a hint that the Australian people want an independent destiny. We are the most dependent of peoples on the planet. I can't think of a state, not Poland, for example, not France or Germany, not another American ally anywhere that is so happy with this status of dependency.
Peter, did you want to comment?
I think sorry, just to add, everything you've said is what we need to fight back against, Bob. Government is under a lot of pressure over AUKUS, and we need to increase that pressure in every way.
Yeah, there's a question. Alice has been waiting very patiently with her hand up for quite a while.
Sorry, Peter.
Thank you. I'm in New York. I'm on the board of World Beyond War, and I've been working on this for a long time. And this conversation is keeping us in a step-by-step process to nowhere. And there are offers on the table repeatedly from Russia, from China, to negotiate a space ban treaty, a space weapons treaty, to negotiate a cyber ban treaty. They will not discuss nuclear disarmament until we discuss that. And, you know, there was a cartoon in the 50s during the first Red Scare, which we're starting all over again. It was called Pogo, where they said they met the enemy and there's us. And I think the peace movement has to tell the history, starting that Woodrow Wilson sent troops to Leningrad to stop the peasants against the White Russians, that Truman turned Stalin down when we formed the UN. He wanted to turn the nuclear bomb over to the UN. We said no, so they got their own bomb. Gorbachev pled with us. They lost 25 million people to the Nazis. He let go of all of Eastern Europe without a shot. Don't expand NATO. Don't let Germany go. We said, don't worry. Let Germany go into NATO, and we give you our word. We will not expand 1 inch to the east. So what do? We're going right up to the border. As a matter of fact, Kennedy and Khrushchev made a deal that Kennedy said you can't let anybody know this. But when they put the nuclear weapons in Cuba, Kennedy's army and the deep state wanted to bomb the crap out of Cuba. And he talked secretly to Khrushchev. And Khrushchev said they put their weapons in Cuba because we had put missiles in Turkey. That was never reported. And Khrushchev said, if you get them out of Turkey, I'll take them out of Cuba. They're just between the two of them. And Kennedy said, okay, but you can't announce it. They'll never let me do it. And Khrushchev took his weapons out of Cuba, and 6 months later, we took ours out of Turkey. And guess what? They're back with nuclear weapons in 6 NATO countries, US. And if we're just going to talk about no first use, which is ridiculous. I mean, that's Dan Ellsberg always said, a bank robber walks in to a bank and points a gun, you're using it, even if you're not shooting it. No first use is it's like a joke. We should talk about what Russia and China keep saying to get their strategic security so that they can negotiate in good faith with us a space ban. If we're going to say we're going to dominate the military use of space, forget it. And if the Australian government is in bed with the deep state of the US and they're part of the white corporate patriarchy that's on the way out anyway, then the people have to speak up and talk about this. We have to talk about the opportunities on the table to make peace, because you know what? Mother Earth can't wait. And we should get the whole climate movement involved with us. You know, tell them there are solutions. We have them. They're put on the table by Russia. Said they wouldn't invade Ukraine if we didn't take them into NATO. They said it over and over again. At one point, Russia asked to join NATO when Clinton kept expanding it in disregard of the promises we made to Fisher. And we said no. So, you know, let's look at who the real bad guys are here. And let's start changing our talk and our dialogue so that we get not our governments, the governments are hopeless, but the people we're going to have to take to the streets. You know, in my country, it doesn't matter who wins the election. I mean, Trump is terrible, but the others are giving us 3 wars, you know, so we're going to have to change things or else we're doomed. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Alice. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. Karina, would you like to say a few words to finish up the session and sort of round off some of the comments that you might have heard? I'm putting you on the spot.
Thanks. Look, I think it's been wonderful to be part of that conversation. I think it's really important for us as First Nations peoples to be at the table. And, you know, Uncle Ray talking about Indigenous voices around the globe to be at the table as well, because we do exist and we do have a say in these conversations and we want to be part of it. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be here this morning to share a little bit of our truth-telling and our story of what happened to Indigenous peoples in Australia and what continues to happen to Aboriginal people, Indigenous peoples of Australia as well. Constant pressure. It's a generational story. You know, we heard from the previous speaker, people have been around. This conversation and discussion has been around for decades now. Well before I came in, people have been talking about this and it's an ongoing thing. I think the more we educate our broader community, and I always think about how do I bring my mob on this journey as well, because we are part of it. How do we best engage with them? And it's with their first language to be involved in the conversations, to know that they have a voice in this country. We're still struggling to come to terms with that where are we placed as Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, in this very country, is where is our voice in this? Although, you know, constantly we are always impacted on this nuclear injustice, constantly, whether it's mining, testing, dumping, all the time, First Nations peoples are in demand to be the solution for that nuclear waste dump. So we need to be in these conversations so we have that voice to be heard as well. So thank you.
Thanks. Well, please join me in thanking Bob, Karina, Peter, and Sue in Canberra. Thanks very much. And we break now for 15 minutes, so if we could be back here at about 11:10 Sydney time, please.
All right, I see lots of people coming back from the breakout rooms. All right, well, I hope everyone had a wonderful time, whether you stepped away from your computer or whether you participated in the breakout room discussion. I would ask everybody to please mute yourself at this point. And we are going to go to the second session of the evening or day, depending on where you are in the world. So I am going to turn it back to the folks at Raising Peace to kick us off for session 2.
Sorry, we're just getting ourselves together here. Welcome back, everybody. While they're getting settled, I will just do a quick plug for Raising Peace, which is a small network based here in Australia of organisations and people dedicated to peace. And I would commend to you our website, which we'll put in the chat. It's raisingpeace.org.au, where we have a wealth of recordings of our past events, and most relevant today is one we did last week with Senator David Shoebridge, which was an update on AUKUS. And really it talks about the economic dependence that that AUKUS is placing Australia in towards the US, the ways in which Australian weapon systems are and components are, you know, out of our control in terms of how they're used. It's a very, very worthwhile hour to spend. But all those recordings can be found at raisingpeace.org.au.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, or wherever people are in the world. There's probably no afternoon. But anyway, I'd also like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on Gadigal country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to thank the speakers from the previous session. I thought it was a terrific session, and I certainly learned a lot. And I'd like to also welcome the speakers for this session. We have, this is a session, I don't know, I think it's a bit of a misnomer actually, being solutions. I was just saying, I think it's more of a session on what frustrated people can possibly do to endure what the world is going through at the moment. So I'm not sure what sort of solutions we'll have, but we'll try. We have, I'll introduce Lilli. Lilli is an organiser for Wage Peace, and she's also involved in Disrupt War. And it says here, when she's not stuffing potatoes into exhaust pipes of the war machine, she enjoys growing vegetables and crocheting socks. Well done. We also have Uncle Pastor Ray Minniecon, is an advocate of climate and social justice, dedicating his life to supporting the stolen generation of Aboriginal people. He is an active executive member of the Indigenous Peoples Organisation of Australia, which is a national coalition of 300 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations. He is also a Kabi Kabi and Gurung Gurung elder, so welcome. And we have Dr. Albert Palazzo, is an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. He was formerly a long-serving director of war studies for the Australian Army. He has a PhD in military history at the Ohio State University. His dissertation subsequently published in Seeking Victory on the Western Front, the British Army and Chemical Warfare in World War I. I'll leave the rest of the bio, but very impressive panel. Thank you all for joining us. So as Alison had mentioned at the beginning, this is a panel ostensibly about solutions, but I'll read the panel description for those who don't have it. Our region is increasingly strategically complex, with an emergent China as just one of the many dynamic forces at play. AUKUS and the Quad are two examples of how Australia is positioning itself while accommodating the United States' strategic presence. So to what extent does the relationship with the US make Australia a target, and how does it compromise our relations with our neighbours? What steps could be taken to ensure a more independent foreign policy? And what might a safe and secure Australia look like from the perspective of First Nations people and from a young person's perspective? We're going to start with Albert, who has a presentation for us today. But just looking back at what was raised in the previous session, we have a US interest which are deeply entrenched in Australia, with, as former panelists said, with little or no utility for Australia, and also the disturbing infiltration of weapons companies in our society and our education system. So look, I'll turn to Albert, who will give you a little bit of background to the US presence in Australia, namely bases, and then we'll follow on with the Q&A that will discuss, solutions or what people are doing. Thank you.
So James, you drive? Okay. Right, well, before I begin, I'd also like to recognize the Gadigal people on whose land we meet and we're speaking today. Well, let's just pop right away to the next slide. Although this title, I think, captures in my mind really the core of the problem here, is that Australia is partnering up with an imperial power who has a certain way to look at the world, and we do this because, for whatever reason, we're basically afraid of the rest of the world, and so we look to the United States to be our great and powerful protector. And until we change that dynamic, we're really, stuck. As Peter was said earlier this morning, the U.S. bases from the U.S. These are the big three. Two of them are long established. Pine Gap, the communications, signals, missile launch, Overwatch base. We can't stress just how important this base is to the United States. It is one of their key core bases around the world. It is the signals intelligence that it gathers from all of Asia, and the Overwatch ability it has to spot the launch of a missile from either China or Russia or India or Pakistan, and the continuing development of that base make it a premier base of vital importance to the United States. Henry Holt is also very important to maintain communications. And Tyndall, now the soon to be the home, or maybe already the home, of American B-52, some of which will be nuclear capable, is growing in importance, and will provide the United States with other options in how to exert its power against those to which it wants to direct its power. Okay, James, let's leap ahead. Okay, but frankly, I don't think the problem is with America. Okay, this is not an American problem. The United States is doing what imperial powers do, and they're doing it very well. And we just have to accept this because, I'm not saying we have to agree with it. I'm not saying we have to like it, but the United States is able to, or is determined to be able to, reach around the world and exert its power. And they're very good at that. And it's the problem that the reason why these bases are in Australia is because of Australia, right? These bases were not forced upon us. We're not, we have not been treated like Honduras has been treated, or other, Central American countries where these bases have been put. We're not being treated like the Marshall Islands. We're not even being treated the way Hawaii was treated. We have reached out to the Americans and made it quite clear to them that if you want to put stuff here, we're more than happy to let you do it. And even if you don't tell us what you're doing, that's fine too. And this has been going on, since the end of the Second World War, and accelerated by Menzies, and now accelerated once again by Morrison and Albanese with the AUKUS agreement, right? And I'm sure President Biden in Washington, when he saw the deal that we were willing to cut, just chortled about the suckers down under, because this is all a very pro-American deal, and it's only getting worse. And if you read the Treaty on Nuclear Propulsion that was tabled about a month ago in August, it is the most one-sided deal that you can imagine. And I only hope that Bob Carr is correct, that at some point this thing just falls right over, because it is not a fair deal, and it's not something that's in Australia's interests. It's in US interests. But as far as Australian governments are concerned, us being seen as a loyal and devoted ally is what we do. So let's skip ahead to the next slide. But of course, being a loyal and a devoted ally does come with a few problems, a few costs. And so far, for the last 60 or so years, Australians have been willing to pay these prices. The Australian government certainly never objects. We lose a degree of our sovereignty. And this is only getting worse under AUKUS. Periodically, we have to pay an insurance premium. It usually takes the form of some soldiers' lives, but it's usually not a huge amount. So the government doesn't seem to be mind paying that. We constantly defer to U.S. policy, U.S. global policy, assuming that what the U.S. sees as their interests is the same as Australian interests, which means our government thinks of us as being part of the United States, which, I'm a migrant and I had to apply to become an Australian citizen. So I have a sense that this is indeed a different country. But at times our leadership seems to think that we're not a different country, that we're so close that we're indistinguishable and that we should follow U.S. policy. We become morally compromised in wars that are either illegal or very stupidly fought. And we continue, and this goes back to pre-Federation, this fear that Australians have of the outsider. We can't get over it as long as we continue to look outside to get somebody to be our protector. So we look at the region, we look at Asia, and all we see is danger. Whereas me being a sort of a military historian, and I think about national security, I tell you, Australia's got to be one of the safest places in the world. I don't know what our government is talking about. This place is really secure compared to other countries in the national security space. But by continuing this relationship, or the depth of this relationship, we continue to institutionalize fear of what is out there. James, skip ahead. However, this dependency on the United States is now so deeply embedded in our national psyche and in our political consciousness. I mean, there's no difference now from either side of the political aisle, from both parties. But we can make a few arguments here about why we should get rid of these bases. And of course, one of them is they're a nuclear target. And I cannot stress enough that if I was an adversary who went into a war with the United States, on my hit list would be Pine Gap. I don't know if it is what the Chinese would do or the Russians would do, but if they're sensible people, you would definitely take out Pine Gap, probably Exmouth, and what the heck, take out Tyndall too. But they have other options here. Why not take out, send a real message to Australia and to anybody else who might be helping the Americans? We're risking here more than just Tyndall or Pine Gap. We're risking Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, because if I was the adversary who had nuclear weapons, I might think, let's send a real message. Let's incinerate Sydney. The US is not going to respond by nuclear weapons against us. They're not going to escalate that far. It's a win for the adversary to destroy an Australian city, and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's what we're inviting. Pine Gap, I'm afraid, Ray, it's not in a densely parted part of the world, a part of Australia. Whereas Sydney could see millions of people die because of this policy. But this policy, this nuclear argument has been made many times in the past, and our government has no traction with it whatsoever. We could prioritize diplomacy, but for whatever reason, our government, doesn't believe in diplomacy anymore, or has downgraded it. The Department of Defense has become the main department of Australian engagement with the world. Our DFAT is now a lesser organization. Its budget's been cut and continues to be cut. Whereas I think if we want to really get after this and figure out how to make ourselves more comfortable in the region and therefore downgrade our fear, it is through diplomacy. But our government seems not terribly interested in doing that. We could improve our cultural understanding of the region, really invest heavily in understanding why the other side, why China, why Indonesia, why Malaysia, think the way they do. And therefore, once you have an idea of how the other side thinks, you can then de-escalate risks. But again, our investment in our region, it's significant. I mean, you know, our embassy in Jakarta is the second largest after America. But it's something that we can really do a heck of a lot more. We could also minimize the military response option. And thereby, if we do that, then these bases, become less relevant, and we could, see them lost. And I have to say, I disagree a little bit with Ray, where he says, we just get rid of the army. But I can make an argument that, the army used to be the reverse of what it is now. The reserve was the main component, and the full-time, force was the minor component. And I could see making an argument where Australia really only needs a reserve army with a small full-time component. But again, that's not something we seem to be wanting to do. And we somehow become culturally less fearful of the world, which require Australians to actually stand up for Australians, and more than just at the Olympics, right? In our sporting accomplishments, those are not really important, no matter the emphasis we put on them. But to understand that we are a confident, relatively powerful state, pretty damn wealthy compared to most of the world, and therefore we don't really have a grounds to be afraid. And if we could conquer our fear, then these bases, then we have grounds for an argument for losing these bases. James, skip ahead. We'll get to that later. Okay, so I'm just going to the second half of that page. So, what can be done? I'm not very optimistic that we'll get rid of these bases in the short term, but I do think we have some options here. And one is, in the future, and I worked in defense for 15 years, and defense writes the defense white paper. And I came to the conclusion that that's a mistake. Defense shouldn't be writing the white paper for security. It belongs to either a separate agency, or very much it should be done by DFAT. And DFAT should be the lead on national security and international security. And defense, should be subordinate. We need a national security strategy. We have to understand what our security looks like in a very holistic, cohesive manner, not just in a narrow military stream. It's that old saying, if you only got a hammer, everything's a nail. Well, if the only response option you have is a military one, well, then that's what you use. But by having a broad-based national security strategy, then you have other options. And also to get the government to understand that national security is not something, that only involves a threat from another state. National security involves all aspects of human security, and whether that is education or providing housing or climate change. These are all security issues which don't get understood and don't get attention because we don't consider them part of national security. Because national security now only means, what are the Chinese going to do to us? All right, that's probably all I have here for now. Let's just skip ahead. Yep, that's it. So we're going to go back now to more of a round table, I think, Melanie. Yeah. And I look forward to your questions.
Does that work? Yes, it does. Thank you, Albert. That covered off on a lot. Look, I will throw my first question to you, Albert, after that presentation, which I thought was, I think that approaching this from a diplomatic angle is a much better option. You know, fund diplomacy a bit better and take money away from defence. But as we heard in the last session as well, we have an environment where the media doesn't question the US alliance. You know, the government certainly doesn't question the US alliance. So I'm wondering how you would suggest to create a political environment in which the government and the Australian public change its attitude towards the alliance and start questioning the existence of secretive bases and ports.
Yeah, that's an enormous question. And it's an enormous question, and one for which I, probably, there's, the answer is not going to be very quick or simple. We've grown up in a political culture that since before Federation, our political leaders have never been comfortable being Australians, right? They, when Prime Minister Bruce retired, he, apparently took up a seat in the House of Lords. I, as a migrant, I find this incredible. And, Tony Abbott, I guess is waiting for his peerage too, because he seems much more comfortable in England than he does in Australia. So I find it, very incredible that our political ruling class, the people who who go into politics and seek political office, just aren't comfortable with, being Australians. They have to say that, they seem to seek the recognition of a much more powerful entity, and that's where they get their legitimization. And I don't know why that is the case. I'm sorry to phrase it like that, but I don't think anybody knows why the case is. But it does seem to be the consistent pattern. And until we get political leaders who are content to be the leaders of, Australia, as opposed to being the deputy sheriff of America, I don't know how we can change.
Thanks. I just want to, great answer, but I just want to add to that. I think the question of how do we get our political leaders and how do we get the general population to change are actually two extremely distinct questions that are should be treated differently. So as we were talking about, and this kind of goes into what we count as national security and what we don't count as being part of national security, but we like a lot of the discourse, I think, around the US alliance is this is good for America, it's bad for Australia. I totally understand the shorthand that's being used there, but it's not in the interest of the vast majority of people who live in America, and it's not in the interest of the vast majority of people who live in Australia. It is in the interest of a very small elite in each country, as all wars are. And I think we lose a lot when we flatten the analysis into being Australia is a state that has a coherent, homogenous set of interests. So yeah, it is not in America's interest either that the US spends trillions and trillions of dollars in its military machine and none on healthcare. That's not in their interest either. So I think, it's really awesome that there's so many international people on Zoom. I think that's one of the reasons that our movements need to have a really strong component of international solidarity, because all wars are fought at the behest of the rich by the poor, basically.
Well said. And I think, a key voice is obviously Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, which is so often ignored, as we heard in Karina Lester's presentation about the devastating effect of nuclear testing on South Australia. But Ray, next question to you is, how do you make your voice heard? And that is something that you brought up. But how do you make? How can the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait voice take a forefront in this argument? And certainly, you know, giving Australia confidence in, you know, it's with our traditional heritage and your voices for peace?
That's a huge, big question. Probably take us another 200 years to solve that one, because it does mean a lot of changes politically within our system here in Australia to recognise our sovereignty first and foremost, and that's not going to happen. Recognise our voice, that's not going to happen. That was knocked out of the park last year. And so we have to go back to basically two fundamentals that we've always believed in. One is that this war that we're in, and it's a 230, nearly 240-year war that we've been involved in defending our country. We haven't done it with weapons. We fought with truth. And the only thing that truth can offer us is justice. And there's two things that we look forward to. One is land rights. I don't mean land rights in our political sense that we want our land back. We do. But also, to flip the coin on land rights, the land has rights itself, because we call the land our mother, and it feeds us, it nourishes us, it does everything possible to ensure our benefits for the future and for the future of our forebears, our next generations. But we abuse it. We have a war with our environment, which we don't even recognize. And the military itself is a major part of that war, because if you look at the US, it's the highest user of the fossil fuel industry, but we don't question it. We don't bring them into the room and say, listen, what are you doing? We talk about them, not to them. And the other thing is not just land rights, but human rights. And I mean human rights in the sense of what was signed by all those countries so many years ago in the UN, but have never enacted for Indigenous peoples. So we're still on the margins. Even if we can find the margin and find the boundaries to the margin, we might be able to step into it. But we don't have a voice. That's simply it. And we don't have a seat at the table. I was in Geneva this time last year, lobbying our three governments, the Australia, New Zealand, and Canadian government, about at the World Trade Organization, to say, look, all the resources that you're taking out of Australia, for example, they're ours. All that coal, that gold, all that stuff, that belongs to us. It's our resource. We are the sovereign owners of that stuff, but we don't get a say in it, and we don't get a benefit from it. And so when I went to the Canadian office, there was the Canadian ambassador there, was a beautiful name, a lady by the name of Nadia Theodore. And she was originally from the Caribbean. So she's black as I was. So I said, oh, this is good. So I pulled her aside and I said to her, you know, you're in a really big, powerful position here in Geneva, World Trade Organization. What do you think is the most important issue facing humankind today? And her response shocked me. She says, the biggest issue facing humankind is trust. We don't trust each other. That's why we build more militaries. That's why we do all of this stuff, because we've lost the meaning of how to trust each other. And it still sits with me today as one of the major issues that we have. And for us Indigenous peoples, we know, look, 1788 came. We're still living in 1788 because the European nations, the US, look at all that they have done to their own Indigenous peoples in terms of their invasions and the ways in which they colonized. They haven't relented their powers. And if you look in New Zealand at the moment, they're actually trying to take back more power from the Maori people. And we don't have any military or support. The only support we have is what we call the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But who listens to that? And so we're still on the margins if we can find the margins, or somebody can help us to show us where the margins are. We might be able to step inside it and start to make our voices being heard. But we'll continue to be on the streets. We'll continue to lobby. We'll continue to do whatever it takes to ensure that we look after our children. And I have a deeper responsibility at the moment because I'm now a great-great-grandfather. And even though I might love that, I have a deeper responsibility to now to say, what kind of a world am I leaving him? And so it's just so important that we get involved in these conversations, but more importantly, that we try to work from the conversations we have to where we can make sure that we are part of, we've got to see at the table, we can make decisions on behalf of our people and upon of our land. That's, you know, and I'll say one more thing too. I think there are other countries that have shown us the way. I mean, I did mention Costa Rica, those 8 words. Do you know what they were? The army as a military institution is abolished. I mean, what a powerful statement. But there are so many other countries too that have gone down that neutrality stage too. Switzerland, for example, I've always admired that country, that it could stay neutral in all those conflicts. But they're not the only ones. Ireland, Malta, all of these countries have all had a neutrality policy. Why hasn't Australia got one? Look at Singapore. Why do we need a military down here when we could have, even what our doc said here today, just a small military? Our reserves could do that. And if we're going to have a plebiscite or even a referendum again, let's go for something like that. What Costa Rica achieved, what those other countries achieved, that we'd put on the table here in our constitution a focus on our neutrality as a policy in the ways in which we have international relationships.
Yeah. Very, very well said. I love the idea of no military, and I don't know, I'm sure many of you in this room may have known my mother, who was a big peace advocate, but she always said, you know, why do we have departments of defense and departments of war? Why don't we have a department of peace? You know, and I think that's where money should be going. I mean, think of the billions that would be saved. You know, I think it's a brilliant idea. But I know that Lilli was drawing the distinction between the people and the government, but certainly with the government in Australia, the last government that advocated solidly for an independent foreign policy, the Whitlam government, was severely punished. You know, that was after 3 years in power. So, you know, the stakes are pretty high, and maybe this is why successive governments have aligned themselves so closely with America as the, well, at the moment, the leading, well, questionably the leading political power in the world, or the leading military power in the world, at least. But Ray, in your presentation, you sort of skimmed over some of the solutions, which I'd like to go to now, which when I first heard them from you, it's like, well, that's severe, but I guess, you know, it makes sense. So if I can pass over to you for your views on what we need, what needs to happen to set the scene for some pretty major changes.
You're referring to the catastrophic. Yeah. So as I've thought about,
I'm just going to interrupt. You guys need to slow down a bit for the translators. Yeah.
Oh. Sorry, that's what I meant to say, that because this is being translated, we all need to speak a bit slower. I think you were fine, Ray. I speed up, but for the sake of the translators.
So as I've thought about, how does Australia become a more independent, sovereign state, and a neutral state? One of the conclusions I've come to is that most of the things have been tried or suggested and just don't go anywhere. And what Australia might need to happen is something that would fall into the, into the catastrophic category, in which the world basically fundamentally changes, and that we're then cast adrift, and we have to make our own way because we don't have a choice. And one hesitates to embrace a catastrophe as the outcome, or as the means, because as that word implies, it's going to be unpleasant for everybody, and probably significant numbers of people are going to die, and then society will reorder itself, and hopefully reorder ourselves along something that is better than what we have now. But there are two sort of event horizons where this could possibly occur. And, one is, of course, climate change. And as climate change continues to grip, and, and the temperature continues to rise, we should anticipate that eventually societies are going to start to collapse because they can't keep up with the impacts of climate events, and the poorer states of the world will suffer the most. Australia is actually relatively well placed to cope, but we could see the United States, as a result of climate change, withdrawing from its worldwide commitments, because when empires start to collapse, it's the periphery that they withdraw from first. And Australia is well out on the American periphery. And we find ourselves without a protector, and we then have to become, self-resolute and independent in a way that we'd never been. So if there's a positive, and I hesitate to use the word, a positive aspect of climate change, maybe that's it. But that's truly a terrible thing to say. And the other terrible thing to say is that as you're all aware, the United States is in the midst of great political internal dissent and tension as the American people stand on the precipice of social turmoil and collapse. And I'm not convinced that if Donald Trump fails, that the problem will go away, and the election of a presidency of Harris will solve everything, and that America will once again be a nice, stable place. I think the causes are much deeper than the individual of Trump, and they will remain, and the United States will continue to tear itself apart eternally. And if it does tip over into social collapse, then again, Australia faces a future where it doesn't have a protector, and then we have to stand on our own. But half of my family still lives in America, and I've got a son working in Boston, and I'm not terribly keen on social collapse in the United States for those very selfish reasons. But it is a way, and I think it is a way that's we probably need to be prepared for. And if you've seen Alan Bean's new book, The Odd Couple, which came out a couple of months ago, according to him, the most danger that Australia faces is not China. It is a collapsed, United States, and the sudden recognition that we're on our own.
That's
if I could just, I think the idea that we could avoid a large-scale societal collapse at this point is like optimistic to the point of naivety. Like, I think it's coming no matter what we do. But I just want to share, there's a quote from Game of Thrones that chaos is a ladder. And so if these power structures are going to crumble anyway, regardless of what we do, there is the question becomes not what do we do to avoid a collapse? How do we mitigate? It's how do we collapse well? And what do we collapse into? And I think that's a better question for our movements to be asking ourselves than avoiding it.
And just to add to that catastrophic future that we're going to enter into shortly somehow, in the World Economic Forum's global risks for 2024, war is the 8th thing on their agenda as a risk. The number two, the number one is the climate crisis, but the second one is AI-generated misinformation and disinformation. And so I find that fascinating, that we could be living in a world of untruths or a place where you have to prove that you are speaking the truth. And that truth telling becomes even much more catastrophic particularly for Indigenous peoples. And then there's also they go through a whole range of other things that are more commercially orientated or fits into the capitalist system's risks rather than society risks. So these kinds of wars as 8th on their agenda. It's the 8th item as a risk.
Wow. Wow. Should we do questions? One question now, and then we'll continue on.
Yes, I'd like my questions for Lilli. And I think the future is in the hands of the young. And I would just like to hear from you on what you think we need to do going forward.
What do we need to do? All of it. All of it. It all needs to happen, you know. Yeah, I don't know if I even count as a young person anymore. The 22-year-olds don't think I'm cool anymore. But I've just been in the streets with hundreds, 25,000, if you believe the media, of young people at Disrupt Land Forces. And I think that we need to accept that we're probably not going to march our way to liberation, and we need to engage in more disruptive tactics that actually really confront the mechanisms that allow for the accumulation of wealth in our society. Like as Mel said, why don't our politicians oppose Pine Gap, US Alliance, et cetera, because they're beholden to other interests, right? And so what we were doing at Disrupt Land Forces was challenging those other interests, the weapons trade that makes money off the situation in which we currently find ourselves. If we can't get organized enough to get in and the reason that we at Wage Peace fixate a bit on the industry rather than state actors is that imperialism is like this huge idea that can be really abstract, and it becomes real and tangible and physical at the point of production. And as soon as it's physical, you can mess with it. You can put your body in its way. You can make it harder for the people doing these things to do what they're doing. And I think like a lot of the time when we speak about the role of protest, we speak a lot about the idea of like sending a message and making your voice heard and like blah, blah. And it does do that. I'm not saying that that's not important or that that's not one of the things that protest does. But I think when we only speak about those things, we limit our imaginations of what our movements could be, because they can also be a physical disruption to the bad thing. You want to cut this tree down? Too bad, I chained myself to it. You can't cut the tree down now. Like that's the logic of direct action tactics, right? It's not actually about a comms strategy. It's not about getting positive coverage in the media, and it's not about swaying the average Australian or whatever. It's like, no, I'm in your way. You can't do the thing now. And I think, yeah, we need to, and not everybody can or will engage in such tactics, but one of the things that we were doing at Disrupt Land Forces was an experiment in diversity. So there are only 2 rules at Disrupt Land Forces, and it's do no harm to life and don't disrespect the other activists and the way that they choose to protest. So if you don't want to go and do the militant things, that's cool. Just don't, but be okay with other people doing it. And I think we really need to get away from, I think our movements need to get away from this idea that we're going to have like one umbrella organization with one umbrella strategy that everybody falls into line with. I think what we actually need to work on is thriving in the chaos of the diversity of the movement, right? And thriving within the spaces where we had Quakers doing a prayer circle alongside the anarchist black blockers, like we had them in the same space, right? When does that ever happen, right? Because we weren't saying this is what's happening and you have to do it this way, and if you're and your strategy is bad and it's not as good as our strategy. We were saying nobody actually knows how to do this, so try everything and be okay with the fact that other people around you are doing experiments too. And share your data. All of it's good data. Even when you fail, good data.
I work at Sydney University, and my office is in the main quad. And for several months, I walked past and had a lot to do with the students in the encampment. And I am so full of pride and awe at how the different parts of the encampment work together. So you had, the Socialist Alliance, you had Labour Against War, you had the Muslim students, and they were all camped out in front. And I think that set of rules is respect others, but also don't criticise them for doing what they're doing. Everyone has a different way of dealing with this. I'll get to the questions later, but because it's International Peace Day, and I really don't think this discussion can ignore what is happening in Gaza. And I think this is obviously the centre of the land forces demonstrations, and certainly the encampment with the students. And, I think it has given rise to this incredible global movement. I mean, if something is good to come out of this complete genocidal assault on Palestinians, it's that it has given rise to a big global movement around the world. I mean, Australia is actually the response here has actually been quite muted when you look at the response in different countries, even America. I think America has been much louder and stronger, particularly the youth in America, on what's happening in Palestine. But, as Lilli said, she's just come back from land forces and demonstrating there. But I'm interested to know from Lilli the actual how the crisis, the genocide in Palestine, is impacting on this youth movement.
Yeah, I mean, huge question. I think all social movements sort of go in waves, right? And often the wave is kicked off by something that was external to the movement, such as the assault on Palestine. So for a lot of young people who are coming into the movement now, this is like their first big political moment. This is the first really big thing that they've been a part of. And I do feel that, if you go and listen to what these young people are articulating, they are articulating a politics of anti-imperialism. And they are talking about US hegemony, anti-colonialism, the links between, like one of the things we were chanting was like Lockheed Martin, blood on your hands, stolen lives on stolen land. So they are articulating the parallels between militarism on this continent that was used against Aboriginal people and militarism in Palestine in the way that is also a settler colonial state. Those links are being articulated constantly in these movement spaces. So yeah, what was the specific part of your question?
I mean, I guess you've answered it really, is the whole challenge to the neoliberal order is symbolized in the movement.
Yeah.
Palestine, perhaps. So, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, that's right. Thank you. That's the thing I was trying to say. Is like, I think our leadership, our political class really underestimated how long people would keep at it. I think when almost a year ago now, when October 7 first happened and the assault on Gaza began, they thought that we'd probably protest for about a month. We'd turn out and there'd be some big marches and then we'd all get bored and go home. But we didn't. And I think that, there's an element of that that is absolutely squarely about Palestine, and I don't want to minimize that in any way. But there is also an aspect of that of it being just such a stark stand-in issue for like global North versus global South, US hegemony versus a multipolar world, like, you know, imperial interest versus Indigenous people's interests, like all of those. That I think the way that this issue can be like a demonstration of all of those sort of broader concepts is part of what's bringing people out. People are sick of it. People are sick of the whole, neoliberal world order, and we need to dismantle all of it to get rid of any part of it because it's all so intertwined. And I think that this moment that we're in now is like young people, you know, really articulating that. Like if we go and listen to what they're saying at the student encampments, at the rallies, etc., that's what they're talking about.
Yeah. Ray, your view on the movement, particularly the pro-Palestine movement, and how that plays into disrupting a system that has discriminated against, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, Indigenous people around the world.
One thing it has done is has taken away the limelight from the issues that we're facing here in our own country. We're trying to solve somebody else's problem, and allowing the other issues of injustice happening within our own backyard here go unchecked. But I did learn something from this particular conference today, and I wanted to say thank you for that. One thing I learned here came from a politician here. What's his name? Bob. Yeah, I knew that. He said that Australia has a constant fear of abandonment. And then you, Doc, emphasised that by saying that Australia must become less fearful. And I see these rises as a part of that fear that even the young people are saying, look, if this happens over there, can it happen here? And I'm saying, well, it's already happened here. We know what genocide is as Aboriginal people. And so it's a similar story. But if you amplify one part of the planet as against what's happening in Sudan or in other conflicts around the world, you know, over 100 conflicts, we sometimes lose focus and see that as the major international challenge that we face. And so we've got to be very careful about that, I think. And I'd like to say that to our young people, that yes, it's a huge, big issue, but it's not new. We know what these kinds of issues are. They're a human rights issue. We have seen this time and time again. Do you know what's happening now? Just over here within our region over here in Kennedy, the Kanaka people. You know, the French police just shot 4 of them in their own country, on their own land. Never a whisper here in Australia. And so I fear sometimes that our young people are being led into these overseas conflicts, which they have got no power nor capacity to actually intervene in, at the expense of all these other ones that they can get involved in and try to resolve, and many of them deal with our young people here in our own country too. That would be my response to that.
I mean, I know that certainly looking at, you know, having gone to protests and having a bit to do with the with young people who are voicing their concerns, they talk about Sudan, they talk about Myanmar. You know, it is an intersectional thing. I don't know if you want to say something, but I saw you shaking your head as well, Albert. Maybe we'll go to you first and then go to Lilli.
As Dwight Eisenhower left office as president, you know, he made his what's become quite a famous speech where he railed against the military-industrial complex. And not only has the military-industrial complex, you know, survived, it's flourished. Land forces is actually a very minor representation of that. And there's quite a significant part of humanity who make their living, and I'm not referring to soldiers or sailors or aviators, but I mean, corporations that are in the business of killing, and it's quite lucrative. The United States has spent trillions of dollars assuring Americans that they can have cheap oil, to the point where, they could have spent that money, domestically on, all kinds of things. So, the Palestinian protests are, I guess part of, or the latest symbolism of that broader military industrial complex reaction to it, and the ability of, of corporations to make money, from basically exporting or human misery. And I don't understand why, how. I understand how. I don't understand why, this happens. Well, yeah, but I guess we don't value money as much.
Yeah, can we do the questions? We'll just sum up, and then we've got plenty of time for questions. I'm almost at the end. But what I do want to do, just to end up, is a quick whip round, the speakers, and going back to the panel description, your one thing or two things from each of you on how to make your vision for making, or your ideas for making, Australia a more peaceful, less fearful, more secure country. I'll start with you, Albert.
Well, people talk about, getting comfortable in your own skin. Well, I think Australians need to get comfortable in their own nationality, and come to terms with who they are and where they are and why they're here, which, as a historian, that means becoming honest with your past, and not only recognizing, a genocide, but also the rest of our past, about why we're here and what we're trying to do, and then decide upon where do we want to go, as a people. And I talk about the need, for a national strategy. But, in the business, we call that a grand strategy, which is where a country places a marker down in the future of what kind of place they want to be. And then you use all the levers of government to get to that point. And we don't have that. We don't even have an awareness that you can do that. And that's where I think, where we need to make progress.
I might go to Ray, you next. So your one or two ideas on how to make Australia a less fearful, safer, more peaceful place.
Become a republic, number one. But I'd like to see white Australia overcome its fears of itself and its isolation, which I've learned today. But I'd also like to see Australia embrace or even employ the whole notion of what it means to be neutral, a neutral nation in all of these conflicts, just like the other countries that have already achieved that goal, and that we would then maybe determine a lot more of the challenges that we face here, not just within our own nation, but within our own region, because we've got some serious challenges here. And I mean, we're the biggest sellers of fossil fuel, which is, creating the opportunity for huge areas of climate crisis throughout the Pacific regions. And we've just finished 2 big conferences with our Pacific partners to try to gather some of the challenges that they face and some of the solutions that are coming through. But also, Indigenous peoples, we knew how to live with our environment and with each other. We have got so many solutions, but we're not listened to anyways. We don't have a voice, and I'd like to see us find a a way in which we can have a seat at the tables. You know, we don't go to the ASEAN conference or the you know, the Big Sevens or the Big Tens or whatever they call themselves. We don't have a seat there. Yet the people who come to this country have a seat there to tell what they can do about me and my people here and my country. And I just don't like that. I want a voice because I have a voice and I have a brain and I know what the solutions can be, but we're not listening to, including our young people. And our young people are just now dealing with far too many serious challenges brought upon us without our permission. When the question we often ask is, what the heck did we do to offend you? What crime did we commit that you would bring all of this stupid stuff on us, whether it be here in Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada? The Indigenous peoples are just suffering under the immense powers of these colonial systems and structures and their supreme orders that they carry out with punity. It just isn't feasible in our mind to comprehend why it is that you do this to us. Do you fear us that much?
Yeah, Lilli. Sure.
And with one, my final one is what Costa Rica, Article 12, what does it say? The army is abolished. There you go.
I love the word abolished. Yeah, I guess I was allowed two, so I'm going to start talking about the first one. Hopefully the second one will come back to me while I'm talking. I think where Uncle ended is a really, and Albert touched on it as well. I would actually sort of articulate it the other way around of like white Australia needs to get uncomfortable with its nationality. I think we look away from the genocide of our past and our colonial history and all of the violence, the militarized violence, which was done in the service ultimately of extractivism. Like, why do you dispossess people of their land? Because there's something in or on the land that you can make money from. And that's what drives that dispossession, really, right? So in terms of, you know, where you were saying, you know, what did we do to offend you? The survival of First Nations people reminds white Australia of its crimes. And I think that people are at their nastiest when they are avoiding feeling shame. And deep down, white Australia knows what it did. And we know we live on stolen land. And that's why we turn so nasty to protect the narrative that we didn't do anything wrong. Like, so, you know, it's like the classic, this happens in an interpersonal level. Like, if I'm abusive to you and then you point out that I was abusive and then I go, oh, how dare you accuse me of being abusive? And I flip it around and make it on you, right? That's a classic, that's part of the, like, you know, I used to work in the community sector, like, you know, that little DV cycle of like, it's like literally on that poster, like to flip it around on you and be like, how dare you call out my abusive behavior? I'm so hurt by that, right? That's essentially what I think white Australia is doing with its colonial past. And what was the second one I had? Yeah. The second one, yeah, probably had something to do with, yeah, still being open to more ways of like intervening in a much more material way. I think intervening in things like the narrative and the discourse and everything like that, that's important, but it's not the only thing that movements can or should be focusing on. I think there's lots of ways that we can creatively influence the dynamics that are in play. And that's what I wanted to talk about, mutual aid. I think that's you know, we've talked a lot about dependency, right? People like, we're afraid to dismantle the system because while it does a poor job of provisioning our needs, it is currently the only thing that provisions our needs. If we build our own community-controlled infrastructure that provisions our need, we no longer need the system. Then we can burn it down.
And I don't, I might just add to a few things here. We have a very seasoned protester with us today who's got an incredible history in the 60s and 70s, Rowan Cahill. And he recently forwarded me some musings that he had written about the future. And I think this is really important because there's major change often happens suddenly. And it has around the world. People don't predict it, like what happened in South Africa or, Algiers. There's so many examples of things that have happened. But I'll just read something that from Rowan's musings. The future is not scripted. It has not been written. Each one of us is a maker of history, either by what we do or what we do not do. The present and the future are always works in progress, and history surprises. So I think we need to hold on to that thought. I think, we as privileged people, everyone here has an obligation to act on their privilege and stand in solidarity with whatever movements, whether it's young people protesting, against what's happening in Palestine or Sudan or Myanmar, or Indigenous people who've been dispossessed from their land, or learning how to deal with a disruption that is highly likely. I think we all have an obligation to stand in solidarity with one another, and that's how change happens. But now I think we can open. I know there's a lot of hands up. Yes, should we start at the back and then we'll move?
Yeah, I'll pass that around. While I'm travelling up there, some things for you to think about. Questions on how can race relations in Australia get to the level of New Zealand, which is suggesting New Zealand is good, was one. There was one about the role of the media in all of this. And that's two, there's more, but I'll pass the microphone for this question here first.
Question first, two very short ones. First to Albert, if I may. You mentioned a couple of event horizons earlier, and you only got to speak about one of them, which was the climate catastrophe. Thank you for raising that. The second question is to Lil, and it's about what do you suggest, Lil, how can we better motivate the great middle Australia and the youth of Australia to change our world for the better? Just a couple of quick ones.
I missed the question.
You said earlier that there are a couple of event horizons that were going to be major changes to...
Yeah, so climate change and a US collapse.
A US collapse, thank you. I didn't hear you get to that bit.
Yes, so, a US collapse is, I don't know what the odds are, but, every day it seems to get worse over there. Both politically with the polarization of the nation into different camps, and the acceptance of Fox News and the acceptance of non-factual news is driving the country into two different directions. And collapse is not guaranteed, but it's certainly on the event horizon, and it's something that you have to treat seriously. And our government is not, I don't believe, treating it seriously, because we continue to tie ourselves deeper and deeper into the United States. And AUKUS, with its 30-year event horizon, would seem to be a very bad bet on the stability of the United States.
Sorry, what was your question for me? I can hear you, don't worry.
How would you suggest is the way we can best motivate, energise, activate middle Australia and younger Australia to participate in social change, the likes of which you were and we all think?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, the youth of Australia are pretty bloody motivated. Like, they're out there. I would say, I'm asked in these spaces a lot, how do we get young people into the movement? Young people are organising and mobilizing and leading their own movements, and we are failing to show up at them, not the other way around. Like, so, you know, they were pretty bloody motivated at Disrupt Land Forces. I tell you what, I was walking around with some 15-year-olds that are far more hardcore than I'll ever be. They are angry and smart, and like, you know, they're not, it's not a random outpouring of anger. Like they're, you know, they're smart, they're clever, they're tactical. They, you know, the kids are all right. In terms of Middle Australia, I'd like, which I know what you mean, but like I sort of hate that term because it's like, what does that mean? Like what? Like who do, and I feel like most of us, like myself included, I'm not excluding myself from this. When we talk about Middle Australia, it's usually like your aunt or someone who you can't convince to come to the protest. That's who you really mean when you're saying Middle Australia, or like, you know, your sister that doesn't come to the thing when you invite her to. Like, anyway, that aside, I think the sort of, yeah, I guess like moderate centrist Australia that's not particularly politically anything is, we're obsessed with this idea that we can educate them into action. Like, oh, if only they knew. If only they knew how bad it was. Oh, we'll have to, if only they all read this book that I read, then they'd see it how I see it. And I actually think it's a problem of empowerment. It's not a problem of education. It's that they do not see a connection between what we're doing or what people are doing in the street and change, right? People my age, like we were like 2003, I was 10. And we saw the biggest ever protests in opposition to the Iraq war that Australia had ever seen. And then we went to Iraq anyway. So that taught, I think that did something psychologically to people my age, right? That's why the ones who are younger than me, like they never believed in the system in the first place. That's why they're so militant now. They're just like, nah, all of that was a lie. And they never, whereas like people my age sort of caught the tail end of the lie. Like, but yeah, basically the kids are all right. And I think with what we need to focus on as a movement is actually connecting action with outcome rather than being like, oh, it's so bad, it's so bad. Oh, we're all gonna die, it's so bad. That paralyzes people. That doesn't actually help them move into a place of empowerment where they feel like they can, where it matters that they turned up.
Just add just one thing, you know, speaking as a historian, you know, revolutions aren't led by the majority. So, you know, it'll come from a smaller subset of society.
Yeah. Liz, we see you on the screen, and I know you've had your hand up for a long time, but I will go to, because do you have a, yeah, from last time, a carryover from the first session? And
well, it's a carryover in a sense, but it's also relevant to what we've been speaking about now. My name is John Lander. I was in the Department of Peace for many years. It was called the Department of External Affairs, and then it became the Department of Foreign Affairs. But as a diplomat, I always believed, and all my colleagues believed, that the work of a diplomat is to preserve peace, to prevent wars. That's the first thing. When I was the junior in the China section working on the recognition of the People's Republic of China, we wrote a policy planning paper in which we said the ANZUS alliance should mean less to us in the future than it has hitherto, and Australia should concentrate on the development of policies based on our own interests and on the interests of our near neighbours. That provoked the fearful reaction that we've been hearing about today. So what we need is not to focus on fear of abandonment, but focus on abandonment of fear. We absolutely need to stop being afraid. As to the question of neutrality, I agree with that, but it implies, of course, that we have to dismantle the alliance. And I think we can look to many countries in the world now that are succeeding in dismantling the imperial alliances that they have got themselves stuck into, and particularly in Africa. So that is something we should focus on. The point left over from this morning was that all of the speakers highlighted that Australia is in danger of being dragged into a war by America against China. America has made it absolutely explicitly clear that it will not go to war against another nuclear power. They will fight their wars by proxy. They're doing so in Ukraine at the moment, and also, of course, in Israel-Palestine. Kurt Campbell said several years ago, America needs to knit together a network of alliances down the First Island chain to contain China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan itself, of course, the Philippines, and Australia. Any war that occurs in our region will be provoked by America using a proxy, ideally Taiwan, and involving all the other proxies. Because, as I think one of the speakers said this morning, the Americans regard Australia as the useful idiots in this region. And that we have to recognize that there are two dangers we face. One is losing our greatest trading partner and becoming economically much weaker by fighting the very country that supports us, which is China, or being punished by the United States for daring to attempt to extricate ourselves from the alliance. And I think the balance of those two dangers is shifting. It's becoming more dangerous for Australia to become involved in a war against China than it is for Australia to extricate itself from the US alliance.
I agree. I agree with all that. Can we
was there a question?
Do Liz first. But no, I agree with all that, John. I don't know if anyone has any comments on. Oh, okay. Okay, Liz, to you.
Thank you so much. Kia ora whanau, and thanks so much, Melanie and Alison in particular. It's so fantastic to see what's come about today in Sydney as part of World Beyond War, and also wonderful presentations by Lilli, Uncle Ray, Albert, Bob, Karina, Sue and Peter. As a World Beyond War veteran and somebody who's been to Robertson Barracks and Pine Gap and other places, and has been involved in our weapons expos in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which finished in 2018. We haven't had a weapons expo since 2018, so they can be stopped.
We were inspired by you, actually.
And I love, Lilli, what you said about the diversity of protest, and you know, the Quaker grannies at one end and the activists who break in at the other end, and the little old lady who writes a letter, you know, to the MP, and everything in between, the education and stuff. It's just really important. I just want to talk about misinformation and disinformation compared to media. I mean, what has happened to media actually educating the public and you know, giving news actually so people know what's going on? And what's been talked about this morning is really disturbing, because when you think about the effect of the United States policies on Australian people, you know, isn't it extraordinary that people aren't actually standing up and going against it? I mean, I suppose it's scary. Fear is scary, but the alternative is much worse, I think. But a peace-based economy rather than a war-based economy is what we all need. And, you know, we need all the things. We need, instead of a NATO-inspired 2% of GDP on military, we need education and health and all the things in education that that actually to develop people. So there's really lots of so many ideas that we could be talking for the rest of the day probably, but you know, John Pilger, Julian Assange, David McBride, David Bradbury, Margie Pistorius. You know, there's incredible people doing amazing work, and I think our latest campaign that we need to work together on is the Stop AUKUS, and you know, we're working on that here in Aotearoa to stop this massive, you know, $300 million worth of nuclear submarines. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So keep on going, everybody. Thank you so much. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say, send all our love from Aotearoa. Thank you.
I want to ask a question of Pastor Ray. It's been said today a fair bit that the settler community in Australia feels insecure, not comfortable with the countries around it, right? Now, I'm not sure, by the way, that recent immigrants from China, India, Iraq, Afghanistan feel that way. But let's say, yes, that a significant number of the settler community in Australia feel that way. Pastor Ray, do the Indigenous people of Australia, the Indigenous people of Australia, feel insecure? Do you feel uncomfortable with the countries around us? And if you don't, where do you get that confidence?
We don't, but we don't have a good relationship with any of our migrants who've come into our country since 1976, and they with us. But what we've learnt from that history too, and that story or that discourse, is the fact that they have been sensitized to be racist towards us within a period of a month since they land. And so, you know, it's about trust again, trust building. And how did they learn that? Where did they learn it? Why did they learn that? And so it's an ongoing struggle for us, and a battle that we, you know, if you look at the reconciliation process, it's we who are putting out the hand to say, let's have peace. But it's always, you know, pushed aside. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart was all about that. This is our gift to the nation. But it was canned again. So from an Indigenous perspective, we've had these relationships globally anyways, or within this region. And so we know each other, and we know how to respect and honor each other in Indigenous ways. If I was to look at the situation from another perspective, I think one of the major issues, and they're not in the room today, but they are representatives here, and that is the major three religions. We don't talk about them. But if you look at those wars around the globe, behind them, who lights the fire? It's the religions, either Islam, Judaism, Christianity, they're behind it. But we never ever question those mongrels. We never ever bring them into the table. And they can get on with whatever they want to do to Indigenous peoples and to others, as well as create these wars. And we don't have any way of actually having a conversation with them, or even stopping them from doing that. And I did ask, for example, in the Ukraine, I had a talk with a pastor over there. He knows that it's the Orthodox Russian Church, the big noda behind it, who's pushing this stuff. But no one questions him. Look at that country called the United States. Look how religious it is. You know, you can hold up a Bible and say, look, on this, I'll go and slaughter some more people. And we just got to sit back and look at it. And I'm asking the question as an Indigenous, what the heck have those three religions got to do with me and my people and my country? And they come into my country, they come in and build all their temples and cathedrals and whatever, but no relationship with us. And so I do question the role of religion in these wars that we're facing as a global community, and what input do they have, and how do we tell them to extricate themselves from killing innocent children.
Can't believe I'm about to defend religion to a pastor, but here I go. I think I don't disagree with what you just said, but I think religion is usually the justification rather than the first mover. And I think in terms of like a lot of the questions that we've heard have been about, like what do our movements need to do, etc. And I think getting a bit better at power analysis is one of the things that we need to do. And I think, like religion, once it's organized and institutionalized, can become a power structure. And then the problem with it is that it's a power structure, not that it's a religion, if that makes sense. So religion can be a really beautiful thing when it's like community to community, like when it's just, like there was a time in England when the welfare state didn't exist, and the closest thing to that was church groups that were looking after, feeding orphan children, like giving healthcare to the poor, etc. Like that can be a really beautiful thing. But, as soon as, it was sort of the beginning of the end for Christianity when Constantine made it the state religion of the Roman Empire, and then it became a way for people to pursue power through the church. So yeah, I think it's fun I totally hear where you're coming from, and I don't even disagree with what you said, but I think that the lens of power, it becomes an institution through which power can be exercised, right? And that's a problem in any institution through which power can be exercised. So like in that sense, like whether you're talking about a church or a bank, it's a power structure. What do you think of that?
It's always the priest who anoints the king.
Are there any other questions? There's, okay.
I just wanted to sew a few things together that have been in my mind between New Zealand, First Nations rights, and neoconservatism and where we might be headed, and where some of the Liberals seem to be headed, the Liberal Party with their attacks on the referendum and Indigenous rights. And it's the loss of, the attempt under the new New Zealand government to turn back the clock and take away all First Nation rights for Maori over land, etc. It's right through the government. It's very alarming. And I was just wondering if any of you are worried about this attack on First Nations and a kind of another layer of racial division that's being spruiked by the neocons to stop us looking at them.
We've often looked to New Zealand as an Indigenous peoples because they had the Treaty of Waitangi. And we have been very, very deeply concerned with our Maori brothers and sisters over there because of the ways in which this new government now is tearing at the heart of that. And we can't understand why. We could call it racism, we can call it a whole range of things. But there is behind racism, there's also some other kinds of agendas that we're not aware of. And I mean, if they're going to pull all this land and all the resources that the Maori people have and give it to their white brothers and sisters, then that to me is that what their agenda is? We don't know what their agenda is, but it is a race war and it is racism that's driving it.
To emphasize on his point of view about religions. Karl Marx says religious is the opium of the. Karl Marx says religious is opium of a human conscience whatsoever. Let's say, the colonization start with the religious, compete with the different religions in the world to colonize another country by religious first, and then later on with a combination with the power of the military, this and that, colonization. So, and also I will say, I live here for a long time. I listen to so many people talking about so many issues. My brother, he was in Canada. He told me most of the Western speakers, something like that, always avoid to talk about the end of the core of the issue. So they're generally talking about turn around, and never go to the point. The point that it connect, affect religious. It root, some root is come from religious. So I say something that only one in the world that say George Bush go to Iraq about religious. He's a born again Christian. He got to do something. Second, Tony Blair also come from religious. At the beginning, he portrayed himself like a atheist. People think he atheist. No, he hide his belief in religion very strongly. He also a Christian born again. He confessed about 3 years ago. So that means my conclusion is correct. Both of them, George Bush and Tony Blair, go to Iraq about religious. Religion put them go to there, not about another thing. Another thing is minor. It's not the main thing. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. I think it maybe
just last response to the religious question. An old Aboriginal elder told me once, he says, religion is for those who believe in hell. Spirituality is for those who have been there.
I do like that. I think we are almost at the end. Do we have time for one more? There was a brief one about media. I really, that Liz had actually mentioned. I don't know, Liz, why the media has been so appalling in covering so many issues, Peter. It was something I was going to ask you actually in the last session about why the media is become a cheerleader for war with China, for example, or has the coverage of the Gaza, the massacres in Gaza have been so appalling. I actually don't know. I can't explain it.
I think the media is just another power organisation in Australia that needs to be dominated by the establishment. And so therefore they hire the people that'll do the job for them. They sack the people who won't. It's just a normal organisation.
Situation normal.
Exactly. Every large organisation in Australia that has an influence like the media is a target for people to take it over and do what they want with it. So the ABC's been a target. It's not just Fairfax getting Liberals on the board. It's not just, the Murdochs doing the job for Western capital. But the ABC is just not a little island of kumbaya. There's a constant struggle going on inside the ABC by the good people and the rest of them. And unfortunately, the rest of them are winning at the moment. Look at what they've done. Had a huge rebellion inside the ABC of a couple of hundred people demanding that the reporting on Gaza shows some impartiality. How about that? Journalists at the ABC asking the ABC to be impartial in reporting genocide. That's a huge moment, I think, in Australian journalism. It's disappeared. It's gone. No one's mentioning it anymore.
I think the way that...
I think the power is it's just another organisation. It's another way of accessing power, dominating the population, avoiding democracy, and people are fighting rearguard action, and unfortunately, it's tough going.
I just want to bring up power analysis again. As Peter said, why are we surprised by that? Why are we surprised that the media is biased? The media has been biased the whole time. It's a capitalist institution that exists to reproduce itself, not its self-stated aim to tell the truth or speak truth to power or whatever, when you put an institution into an economic system that rewards profitability, quickness, newness, like they are not incentivized to tell the truth. They are not incentivized to fact check. Why are we surprised?
How do we get truth to people?
How do we get truth to people? Well, I do it in the streets. If you've got a better idea, I'm open to hearing it.
And I think this is where social media does come into play. But just on that, the ABC's response to journalists asking for less, fair coverage of Gaza was to pull them off stories that had anything to do with the Middle East. I mean, that was their response, which is...
Colonialism in its bloody form that we're seeing in Gaza. I mean, the Vietnam War coverage was occasional photographers and videographers, but now we're getting it daily from everyone's phone in their pocket. That's why the crackdown's coming, to close down social media, to close down independent media. We've got to fight this fight. We won't even get the information. But obviously, the next step is always empowering the community.
So subscribe to your independent media outlets, everyone.
I also just want to say that I think we obsess about the media a lot in our social movements, and we get bad coverage of our protests or whatever. We're like, oh no, the Australian doesn't like us. But I think they don't like anyone, first of all. I think it is a waste of energy and capacity to try and influence to try and get the Australian to give your left-wing social movement positive coverage. But I do, and also I think what we ignore is we love talking about how, faith in public institutions, trust in public institutions have never been lower, right? So while the media is putting out these, very sanitized, biased, accounts of what's happening, or very paper-thin analysis that is, mundane and banal, in my opinion, a lot of the time, people don't necessarily believe it, actually. And I think we do ourselves and our fellow humans a disservice when we assume that everybody else, if you don't believe everything you read in the news, why would you assume that everybody else does?
I'd just like to ask about the word power. We've been using the word power a lot today, and I'm wondering how we change that word power to force, because it seems to me that force is what we're actually up against, not so much for power. And if we were to use the word force, then people would understand what we're actually up against, this term power.
Can I get Albert actually to give, since you've looked at lots of wars along the way and media reactions to wars or complicity in wars, your reaction to the different sort of the force, how to change force power into force?
I don't use that word because I'm avoiding getting charges.
Do you mean force in the physics sense?
The whole world is upheld by force. All the structures, if someone does something, you just said, oh, I don't want to get into trouble because the force will come against me.
And
the family unit is held often by the man, force. And so what I'm trying to say is, we keep using the term power instead of using what is really happening is by force. You've got to do things by example rather than by force, I think, or by education rather than by force. I don't know how we can do that, but I think that we can change our language so that our language becomes more acute. So people can't hear online if there's no microphone on speaker.
Okay. Yeah. In the warfighting sense, they use the word force. They don't talk about power, and they use force because the goal of war is to force your opponent to say, okay, you win. To force your opponent to agree with what you want to do. So, I'm trying to do this to you, and at some point, I want you to agree to it. And the person who is the force is being applied to, they're just trying to avoid it, to to avoid being forced to agree. And so the war continues until one side or the other accepts what the other side is trying to do. And then a new relationship emerges. So force is very much the word in the war, in the war sense. And, militaries, generate force, in the Australian Army and the US Army, they talk about the force generation cycle in, how they go about generating not just military capabilities, but then using those capabilities to exert, force or pressure on their opponent. No. No. Yeah. But in the military sense, force also implies that you have some kind of objective of what you're trying to achieve. And but sometimes they don't really understand. I think ultimately that's one of the problems with Gaza, why Gaza has become a genocide, is because if you ask the IDF, what are you trying to achieve? What's your end state? What does peace look like? They don't know. So they're stuck in this cycle of just killing.
I think that's a very sobering point to end on. But, we must all, continue to stand in solidarity with everyone fighting, and fight yourself, subscribe to local newspapers, attend events. Sydney University actually has a number of upcoming events that deal with, the ethics of university research and investing, super fund investment. There's also one on protest coming up. I can share the details with James, who can maybe share with the people here. But I think now we have a closing comment from Alison. Is that right? Chris first. Chris, a closing comment from Chris.
I was asked to give sort of a bit of a summary, sort of trying to draw things to a conclusion. Our theme has been resisting the US's military empire. Australia's always been aligned with military empires. First, of course, the British Empire, and that's why we had the atomic tests in South Australia and the impact that had on Aboriginal people there. And now, of course, the military empire is the United States. AUKUS is, in fact, it's just a more recent example of an alignment that we have been following since the Second World War. We have become more aligned with the US, more militarised, more giving over of our sovereignty. We've seen the expansion of Pine Gap and the Darwin bases. We've seen the infiltration of weapons companies into our education systems, from primary school through to university. We don't question the military effect on the environment. We haven't really spoken very much about that. And so we've, through this day, been given details of the impact of our alignment with the US military enterprise, the US military empire. But we've also been given some hope. And so let me give you some of the comments that were made that I think are more positive ones. We were told that we need to give more emphasis to détente, be willing to relate to other nations and follow a different way of relating to the US, be willing to challenge the US, affirm our independence as a nation, rather than simply going along with everything that the US does. We need to recognise that we need a communication strategy, but not just a communication strategy. We've also heard of the need for direct action in a range of different ways. We need to challenge weapons companies and their infiltration into schools. We need to question our government as to why are we so fearful? Why are we so willing to go along with the US? Can't we be a more independent nation? We've been a nation for 120 years. Why can't we be our own nation, our own people? We need to become less fearful of the outsider,
fearful of China, fearful that we need a big brother protector. What kind of Australia do we want? We need to become more neutral, more non-aligned. We need to broaden our security strategy, so it includes far more than simply a military strategy. Let me finish with some of the concluding comments that were made here. We need to get comfortable with our own nationality, be truthful about the past and present, and look at where we want to be and do for the future. We could become a republic, overcome our fear and embrace what it means to be a neutral country in our sphere of the world. White Australia needs to become more uncomfortable with its actions. We need to be open to different ways of trying to influence and finding a range of options for influencing what's going on. And finally, I think the hopeful thing is history does surprise. Change can come suddenly, so there is hope. Thank you.
My job is just to say thank you. Thank you, Chris, for that brilliant summary. Nobody else could have put it together so succinctly without doing offence to any of the brilliant remarks that we've heard today and any of the excellent questions that we're discussing. I think we all go away enormously enriched by this, with heaps to think about. I have to write something up for one of my organisations, so I've been taking lots of notes. And I'm going to use what I hope faithfully all of you have said and contributed to this. It's been absolutely marvellous. I want to thank our moderators in both sessions, Keith Suter and Melanie Morrison, who have both done a great job. All of our speakers who've been terrific. Our audience questions too were marvellous. And I promised Karina Lester before she left that I would make one point in addition to all of that, not to displace any of the other enlightened remarks we've heard. And that's this. She says, First Nations people have never had a voice at the table. Along with that goes the fact that all other Australians lack a voice unless they happen to be in the executive of government and inside the National Security Committee of Cabinet. The rest of us are totally voiceless as First Nations people are, about what happens to us, about what happens to our land, about where they put the waste, where they put the bases, who they go to war with, when they go, and with what weapons. All of us are in this same thankless boat. Let's go back to what Chris said about we have hope. We can do things. Thank you again.
I want to thank everyone who joined us both in person in Sydney and all over the world virtually for day one of No War 2024. I hope all of you will join us again virtually from all over the world on the same Zoom link for day two in about 9 hours. It'll be 8 a.m. Eastern time where I am, but we'll be zooming over to Germany for the live conference tomorrow at 2 p.m. local time in Germany. We'll be thrilled to be joining live there in Wanfried for the next section of the conference, and we'll be thrilled to be welcoming once again people from all over the world to join in for day two. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for day one, and we are just getting started for this weekend, and we're so honored to have you all with us. Thank you so much.